Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builder, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. For the last 4 weeks, we've been really honing in on the Iran war. We covered what happened in week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and really there's nothing new to say other than more confirmation around the market dynamics at work, which I'll just give a quick recap on tonight. I'm going to be going through effectively just a few bits of a market update. And also, we're going to be playing a podcast that I gave in London before we had the jet fuel crisis issue. So it was covering the latest in Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. And it was with Archie from Bitcoin Archives. And I went through all the different things. There's really a grand macro recap of exactly what's happening right now on all those fronts so that we can zoom out a little bit because we've been heavily zoomed in into the micro. So firstly, let's do a bit of a recap on everything and the markets that I'm looking at in order to make my assessments on how to prepare and what comes next. So, firstly, there is a large global macro agenda. Let's call it the global reset. This is the World Economic Forum. You will own nothing and be happy. The technical industrial complex ushering in their Orwellian 1984 nightmare. It consists of social credit scores, carbon credit tokens, artificial intelligence, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, things that I've talked a lot about over the years. If you want to have a recap of this topic, go to my blog, SimonDixon.com, and check out an interview where I was invited by Catherine Austin Fitz. She was recently featured on Tucker Carlson, and I gave really into the detail of many of those technologies. And you can find that on my blog. Just type in the name, or you can find it on my YouTube channel as well. That's the big macro thing, the global reset. That involves the repricing event, and the trigger for this has been the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, the agenda will be either weaponized or you believe it's coordinated. I explain by following the money how these things are more coordinated. You may believe that it's a reaction to events that are unfolding. It doesn't really matter. Following the money is how we got you ahead of all this stuff years ahead. Even way back, if you remember the Russia-Ukraine war, when I did those emergency broadcasts, and I was saying that this would create that inflationary cycle, and then that would lead to eventually the installation of Trump. Trump will usher in the Iran war. And then I talked about how the tariff policy potentially reversed that need because everything was being achieved. But it appears we needed this big global reset. So I talked about the play-by-play of the coordination of the 12-day war. And I thought we were going to have another one of those, but no, we've done something much bigger. This is Operation Warp Speed 2.0 to effectively reprice all commodities and all energy and achieve effectively 2 years of slow change in one fell swoop. So that's exactly what we're witnessing right now. Now, when you go a layer down, you have the geopolitical side. This is effectively the Western captured governments that are captured by the lobbies, the financial industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and the technical industrial complex, primarily that I've been covering. They are ushering in this multipolar world. And we're seeing right now all the trends play out in real time. You've got America that is effectively vassalizing Europe and the Western Hemisphere, and shrinking America into a regional power, but presenting it as if it's MAGA and world domination and building the greatest American empire in order to satisfy the Q-tards and the MAGA-tards type of narrative. When really what is happening here? Well, you're seeing effectively the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, which eventually will be normalizing with Iran via China. We've started to see that there was meetings in Pakistan China put together a 5-point framework. US gave a 15-point plan that involved JCPOA on steroids, where effectively Iran could still have a civilian nuclear program. And effectively, just really the 15 points. Iran came back with their 6 points, which involved the expulsion of the US from the Middle East. This gets declined. We have a lot of market manipulation in between, but nothing stops this train. We've got the financial industrial complex vision of regional stability, and then the legacy military industrial complex that is represented by radical Zionists in Israel that work for military contractors and military profits, the evangelical Christians, neocon Zionists within America that think they're strengthening the dollar in America is still the global hegemon, kind of represented by Lindsey Graham and those types of cartoon characters. And then the hardliner factions of the IRGC, which effectively have the death to America, death to Israel narrative that created the strategic tension that basically created trillions of dollars of money printing and profits for the military industrial complex, leading to the forever war. You need to expel those in one operation. Now, the military industrial complex, old model, is resisting against the financial industrial complex, which is why I believe this transitioned from a theatrical 12-day war to something more extreme, which is then the bigger trend of the global reset as well. But still, the outcome is the same. Multipolarity, the Middle East becomes West Asia. Iran is infrastructure weakened in order to create a China dependency. The GCC vassalizes Israel, creates a Palestinian state. But we're then getting the economic weakness of the GCC as it accelerated by expelling all the US operations, US ties, so that all those contracts can be renegotiated. We're already starting to see, for example, Saudi Arabia, they formed a new defense pact with Pakistan, Turkey. I think that will be integrated into Egypt too. You then started to see interesting things where Trump came out and said, kiss my ass to MBS effectively. And then suddenly Zelensky comes over to the Gulf countries. They have vast experience of dealing with asymmetric war with Russia in terms of drones and missiles. And so you started to see a kind of defense pact, which I translate as Ukraine becomes more and more vassalized, you brain drain NATO into the Gulf countries by kind of pushing over those intel, and really the only country that has direct experience from NATO technology, US technology, and battle tested against Russian missiles and drones and various other things that happened, which have kind of set the framework for this asymmetric war with Iran, Israel, and US. But obviously, we know that these are the corporate power factions that we've covered. And I'll cover that more in the podcast, give an update on these changes. Combine that together, and effectively the Middle East becomes West Asia. The GCC and BRICS align through normalization with China. And the growth becomes the global South. And then you have the build back better opportunities, which the financial industrial complex is using their vassal states like UAE, India, to try and get as big a grip on as possible, and Israel, while we enter into this new transition, which really, I believe right now happens. I originally thought it would happen in April with the Xi Jinping and Trump meeting at the China summit, but that got canceled and moved to May. Then we had these very theatrical micro announcements with Trump and the market. So let's jump into those right now. So prior to this war, what were the trends? The trends were the dollar was weakening relative to gold, silver, and DXY, which is a basket of currencies like the euro, the pound, the Swiss franc, the Japanese yuan, the Japanese yen, and various other currencies. Now, that was weakening, that was effectively strategically transitioning away from the petrodollar, the euro dollar, and the Japan carry trade as the Bank of Japan increased its interest rates and started going off on its own eastward facing path. Prior to that, we had tariffs, which drove everyone into BRICS. We had massive mergers and acquisitions. The tax was paid primarily by the US small business. The large multinationals had transnational relationships to hedge out their exposure. And the export dependent countries got gobbled up into transnational capital and these larger multinational institutions. And so, and then everybody negotiated with China. America looked crazy. Trump says he's taking on the deep state, which is everything that props up the dollar. So you get that weakening of the dollar. And then you get fiscal dominance, where effectively you're printing your way to devaluing the debt. And that creates a massive stock market stimulus, but dumps all the debt on the American people. You get the K-shaped economy, you get wealth inequality, and that creates the environment for civil unrest and then external wars. And then you weaponize that through the technical industrial complex. All the things that we've been discussing over the years. Then the Iran war came, and it became much bigger than I originally anticipated in terms of the goals. The end goal is the same, but it accelerated. So we still end up in multipolarity. We still end up shrinking America to a regional power, but it reversed all the macro trends. So the dollar started strengthening because immediately the countries that are pegged to the dollar went into stress, i.e., the Gulf countries. So, in order to protect their peg to the dollar, they had to sell a lot of US treasuries. They didn't have much of them. So, they were accumulating US equities. The market corrected because the Gulf countries no longer are acquiring those US equities. They stopped buying US treasuries. So, they're selling down their US treasuries, which is why the yields and the cost of the American debt is going up. But they also had to probably sell down gold. I think that created a correction in the price. Also, the market was signaling that this would be over quickly. Now, the Trump speech last night said another 2 to 3 weeks. We don't know what to believe. We don't believe him, but the market is still signaling that I always said this would be this is going to be a long-term disaster into an extended war if both oil and gold go up at the same time. But at the moment, those relationships are not staying. Gold, every time it looks like we're going to go into and continue the war, starts to weaken rather than strengthen. So you've obviously got those trends. It had a big run. It was overpriced. You have the pegs that need to be defended, but also there's not that exodus into gold, which implies that the smart money believes this will be over in a reasonable time frame. They recognize the global reset, so the private corporation, big oil, are profiteering from that trend, but it's not leading to that exodus away. But what is actually happening? When the war happened, you had the strengthening of the dollar, you had the renegotiation that helped big oil, you dump all the debt on the American people, so the debt gets bigger. A few small companies benefit from it. You get the MAGA narrative that we're helping America, but the oil is not nationalized and the energy is not nationalized. In fact, some of those private companies, I said the ownership structure is 70% Qatar and 30% Exxon on some of those liquefied natural gas contracts. But who does have nationalized oil and energy? Iran and Russia. So Iran and Russia are benefiting from the higher prices. They got the sanction relief in order to get the price of oil down. And so they're able to sell into that while their infrastructure is strategically being targeted as we enter into this transitionary phase. Obviously, China's going to be getting those rebuild contracts, and there'll be localized manufacturing as well, probably Turkey and various other things. But obviously, this pushes GCC and Iran into BRICS, and Iran is a member of BRICS as well. But there will also be the negotiation between the financial industrial complex being involved in those rebuild contracts. But you have effectively, when the war is believed to be moving towards World War III, which I still don't believe it will be, there will be a deal. This will make the transition. The reason is because the straight closer creates a doom loop for the American economy. We have state of emergency in Asia and Europe. And if you get that into too much demand destruction, you get a global recession. If the strait were closed for another month, another 2 months, another 6 months, guaranteed global distress, depression, demand destruction, and counterintuitive to the goals of the financial industrial complex, which is why the military are squeezing everything they can and creating the next war zones as they transition away from this forever war in the Middle East. But you have the weakening of gold when it looks like it's World War III. You have the price of oil never going above that $115. You have disjointed between American oil WTI, Brent crude global, and Middle Eastern oil in Oman, which is like, those three-tiered pricing. That's creating arbitrage opportunities to sell into different markets. So, for example, America could sell into the higher prices of Brent crude in Europe in order to sign those greater contracts. It creates problems within the US, and we're starting to already see jet fuel issues globally, including the US. That is leading to the lockdown narrative, states of emergency, preserve your energy. I covered all the market updates on my blog and on YouTube, into smaller ones each day I've been doing as well. But you're getting the strengthening of the dollar, gold not creating an exodus, so weakening slightly. You get oil going to those higher prices, which causes inflation and eventually can only have demand destruction because there is a structural lack of oil that's needed for all of this production. And the markets, the markets are effectively having all the volatility trade in the stock markets, but most importantly, the cost of the US rolling over its debt is increasing. The 10-year Treasury reached that 4.5%, and Trump takes action. The 30-year Treasury or 20-year Treasury hits that 5% mark, and Trump takes action. So the oil price is not allowed to go above 115, the 30-year Treasury 5%, and the 10-year Treasury 4.5%, because the 10-year Treasury breaks the mortgage market. We got mortgages above 7%. You can't refinance the individual and corporate debt at those rates. And the government debt goes into a doom loop at those higher prices. Remember the game. The US has an average cost on their debt of 3.3%. These higher bond yields means that it goes up. There was meant to be a regime change at the Fed, but if you have inflation, you can't push down those rates. So we're not going to get the short-term rate cuts, and we're getting increased rates in the long term. America, to sustain that, has to decrease the cost of their debt below the 3.3% and increase the growth rate of their economy. What's happened? The growth rate is now forecasted to be 2% and 1.7% next year, if the strait opens in the near term. If it goes longer term, then you will revise those expectations down and it will get worse. And yields will go up, and you could enter into a doom loop where effectively the viability of the American financial system of rolling over the debt and using US treasuries as collateral disappears, which creates a deficit blowout. You get a lower in tax collection, and effectively the dollar enters into a doom loop and takes the US economy with it. I believe they want a managed recession, a managed transition rather than a taking down the whole US economy with it. They want a slow death, a slow depression, so that they can extract all the assets out and then they can return to what was happening before. So during the war, effectively, the S&P and US markets are outperforming foreign markets. But every time it looks like the war will end, i.e. Trump has to come in and capitulate and taco as a result of oil prices and bond yields, the market goes back to where it was before, where foreign markets outperform domestic markets. Gold goes up to weaken the dollar. DXY goes down below that $100 mark. And we return to the trend where we were before, the strategic weakening of the dollar while asset stripping and pushing capital outflows globally. BlackRock's ETFs as a share of US versus foreign investments. Firstly, BlackRock's up to $14 trillion managed. Aladdin's technology is now up to $25 trillion, which all the central banks are using and the money managers. And also the 55% foreign invested. And so ETFs become the structure where you have less control over the dollar and the dollar becomes less important in a multipolar world for managing capital inflows for the financial industrial complex as they negotiate into this multipolar world. So we see that every time it looks like the war's going to end, like yesterday, we had a big relief rally. Stock markets went up significantly. And then gold comes down, the rates come down, and oil prices come down. Then Trump makes an announcement which reverses that trend by saying we need 2 to 3 more weeks. We're decimating, we're winning, but we're probably going to move into now the theatrical final act, which is where we have this big Hollywood movie, maybe a small ground invasion to take over one of the islands that effectively can either lead to escalation from the IRGC, where American troops get sacrificed for the Hollywood movie in order to end this and move to the next phase. But it's not a real ground invasion because real ground invasion requires 600,000 troops. And massive deaths and casualties from American troops as well, as the IRGC has those million troops. And obviously it's asymmetric war because everything's protected by underground bunkers that have a missile program and a drone program. Infrastructure is being destroyed, no doubt about it. This is going to be expensive and costly. Israel will be weaker. Iran will be weaker. But they'll be moved more into vassalized into GCC and BRICS at the end of this. The Gulf countries will be weaker. They're having an economic hit, no doubt about it. But that, again, pushes the GCC and BRICS closer. And then American military can exit. And then you have the financial industrial complex. The weaker they get, the more the negotiation between Western financial powers and Xi Jinping, which is personified by the end crescendo in my prediction right now with the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump. So the further they get delays, the more negotiations need to happen. Once that is set in stone, I think the Iran and the Strait need to be open, or a framework for how it opens, which resets the world order. We get the global reset. Now, in the meantime, everything gets worse in Europe and Asia. China has its large strategic petroleum reserves. It has the relationships with Iran and Russia. And then American privatized oil interests vassalize up the Western hemisphere or the Northern hemisphere, Europe. And effectively, China and BRICS become the leader of the global South. BlackRock and the financial industrial complex vassalize the West, make the K-shaped economy further, make the cost of living worse and worse and worse, and then manage capital outflows into these renegotiated financial centers and technical centers and military centers that they're trying to negotiate across the global South and across Asia, split the world up into multipolarity. So that was really, really clear this week. Every time people think the war's going to end, we return to that trend. As the war continues, we reverse that trend and it gets worse economically for everyone. Now, Trump gets to push the MAGA narrative that we're okay, we got oil. Meanwhile, the private credit markets are blowing up. The foreign direct investment is blowing up. Foreign countries are not able, they have to sell their treasuries in order to facilitate their own energy needs. You get the blowing up of the euro dollar, the petrodollar, and the Japan carry trade. And all in all, that leads to full vassalization of the fully privatized, securitized, and financialized economies, where you have a full-blown FIC takeover, and any civil unrest helps tick in that police and surveillance state. And if the war escalates out of control, then you bring the forever war model home, and Mick gets to profit from it. Either way, we're having ginormous concentration of power into the privatized proof of weapons network. And the multipolar world is where they have to negotiate with these vast pools of sovereign wealth capital. So all of that is happening, and it's clear what the trend is. As soon as the war ends, we get back to where we were, but with the global reset in the middle, accelerated. As long as the war continues, then everything gets worse in terms of concentration of power in the West to the financial industrial complex, and they get more power to negotiate these shifts. But they don't want demand destruction. We will get a recession, but if this carries on for months, we're in a depression. Prices of oil are like $200, and we enter into a market which is counter for all parties. That's why the price of oil is bounded at that $115 and the yield at that 5% and 4.5%. So without further ado, now let's get into the big picture, the podcast where I did an update on what this means for Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. And this is with my good friend Archie from Bitcoin Archives. And this was hosted in a face-to-face podcast in London. Just before we do that, beware, you are going to have to prepare for supply chain issues. Even if this ends right now, jet fuel shortages, there is going to be all sorts of behavioral changes. These supply chains are going to cause major issues. And you need to make sure that you're protecting your local supply chains. If you're spending less than you earn, you're buying into weakness, you're doing the sovereign strategy and everything we've been discussing. So now, without further ado, let's move over to the podcast. And I will see you this time next week for Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. Peace. We will look back at this moment in history and realize this was the confiscation of as many Bitcoin from weak hands over to Wall Street as we transition to this multipolar world where Bitcoin as a digital scarce asset will play an increasingly important role. Many investors are like capitulating, saying none of this makes sense anymore. The market is not the market. We are 100% centralized control by the financial industrial complex at this stage. The price of gold has gone through the roof. Then we had the correction leading up to the oil crisis, the strategic Venezuela war. Now we've got the Iran war. To me, this is all part of a managed transition. Now, the reason why Bitcoin didn't go up is they didn't have enough Bitcoin. They built the derivative complex and they created all sorts of media FUD to make people think Bitcoin's over. To me, that's a very bullish indicator if you're long term. It means they want Bitcoin. It means Bitcoin's important.
Archie. Simon Dixon, welcome back.
The world has changed. Good to be back. I really can't even imagine what's happened between now and the last interview.
No, so we last spoke, I think it was late September, around October, something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so to recap, everything was all good in the land of Bitcoin. We were just about hitting 125, 126. It was virtually the peak of the price action in 2025. The crescendo of, screams of people calling for a ceasefire in Gaza was happening. And that was the geopolitical crisis that was front and center, requiring, resolution. And we had a good conversation around what was happening in the Gulf region in that context. Never would have thought, and given that what happened in June, July last year as well with the 12-day war between Israel, US, and Iran. So we thought that was kind of resolved and maybe that can was kicked down the road. And so ever since then, so we've had a massive drawdown on Bitcoin. So in October 10, there was a huge red candle day. And it still hasn't really come to the surface as to what happened on that day, but it was almost a 10% day. Quite anomalous. In Bitcoin, we're kind of used to volatility, but even within that context, that's not the sort of thing that happens, every month or even every 6 months. It's a kind of once every year event, and it typically marks some kind of turnaround, some kind of event that's happening, bullish or bearish. And in this case, I guess nobody has floated to the surface, but we've had a 50% drawdown since then. And so I wonder if that was the starting gun for the bear market.
I think we've had the full Bitcoin financial industrial complex, financial weapons of mass destruction built in order for Wall Street to take control over the short-term price of Bitcoin. That doesn't change my long-term thesis. and it's a great opportunity for those that have a long-term accumulate every month regardless of price strategy. But we've certainly seen on 1010, there was some kind of under the radar small Terra Luna type of event that caused a controversy between Binance and OKX. We saw cascading liquidations. We've seen strategy accumulate into Bitcoin treasury companies. We've seen a number of what will probably be the key Bitcoin treasury companies. We've seen controversy over the history of Bitcoin as it relates to developer infiltration in the Epstein files. And we've seen the ETF manipulation tactics that can be used as a result of Jane Street and other players being appointed representatives and being able to issue paper Bitcoin ETF and having a settlement time before they have to cover that, which created this opportunity to use the derivative complex in order to push the price down and accumulate Bitcoin into treasury companies and also fully vassalize the treasury companies. And so we had the collapse of Nakamoto that also led or was already going to have the strategic acquisition of various assets like the Bitcoin conference company, the Bitcoin media arm. And so within that Wall Street structure now, which relies upon partnership with Cantor Fitzgerald with all of these, you've had key assets accumulated into Wall Street wrappers. We've had what will potentially be forecasts here. We don't know whether these are happening yet, but we had Jack Mallers launch his 21 Capital, again, in partnership with Tether. The broker and the investment bank is Cantor Fitzgerald. We know from Epstein files, things that I was covering before around Howard Lutnick's controversy in terms of his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, being Jeffrey Epstein's neighbor. And I was warning everybody that to stay away from Cantor Fitzgerald. They want to margin call everybody. They want to create the environment of, building a derivative complex with JP Morgan, with Goldman Sachs, with Jane Street. And so Jack Mallers will most likely be, my guess, I don't know if it's going to happen, but probably acquiring and wrapping Strike into the Bitcoin treasury company, which started offering Bitcoin-backed loans. And so you have the apparatus for these margin calls for those that are going to lever up their Bitcoin. And then we also have Adam Back's launch as well. And we saw, Adam Back was also had a controversial background that was revealed within the Epstein files as well. And so we can see that there is a connection around infiltration of various assets of the Bitcoin community. And my guess is that they're probably going to roll Blockstream into that company as well, that Bitcoin treasury company. So we're seeing a careful orchestrated strategy in order to try and centralize into Wall Street various components of Bitcoin infrastructure, whether it be those that can influence developers, those that can influence Bitcoin-backed loans, those that can accumulate Bitcoin, which is strategy, MSTR. But also they launched a series of products which rely upon ever-increasing levels of corporate debt and the payment of dividends based upon various volatility parts of the equation. So now you have, via the ETF and Jane Street and appointed representatives, the ability to create paper Bitcoin and manipulate the price down and then cover it to accumulate Bitcoin. You have the ability to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible through strategy. You have the ability to create Bitcoin-backed loans within a centralized Wall Street wrapper. Strategy is offering dividends and corporate debt structures that can lead to in a cascading liquidation situation, the ability that strategy needs to go to Wall Street every time it needs a bailout or sell its Bitcoin. And those two events create a media narrative that you can then use. And so we started to see lots of media narratives to crash the price of Bitcoin. We had the whole release of the Epstein files and all the FUD around that, which there was nothing worrying in there, but there was revealing that there were attempts to try and, conquer parts of Bitcoin. To me, it was a story of how resilient it is, which we can go into.
Yeah, we need to do, because, just a mere association with the name Epstein implies that Bitcoin was coercively controlled and everything downstream from there is tainted. But we'll break that down a little later.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, to me, it was just how important Bitcoin is, that they felt that these deep state operations need to try and infiltrate Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And then we have, these influence over development via organizations like Blockstream that they may be able to put into a Bitcoin treasury company. So there's been a clear operation to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible in the Wall Street wrappers, and get people as leveraged as possible by offering various derivative products. And so the entire manipulation of short-term price infrastructure has been set up, which means effectively you are crazy if you try and outtrade Wall Street, because they have tools that you don't have, and you will get wrecked. And if you lever up as well, you're likely to get wrecked. These are tools for stealing your Bitcoin, playing the markets. So all of that has been built, and it seems like it required a war with Iran in order to turn down the price. Now, there may be more upside, there may be more downside. But I think this was trying to centralize the ownership of much Bitcoin in Wall Street wrappers, and reposition. We also saw a lot of FUD from OG Bitcoiners that were allegedly selling their Bitcoin. I couldn't prove this, but the same people that were continually mentioned in the Epstein files, like Peter Thiel, were some of those likely candidates of old Bitcoiners that may have been selling their Bitcoin. And so we've seen the complete apparatus of, institutional inflows via ETFs, Bitcoin treasury companies, the derivative complex, combined with media manipulation in order to shake out weak hands, to get as much Bitcoin, reposition Wall Street, ahead of the fact that we also had all of these public displays. One, we're having an oil crisis. We had a silver crisis. We had the gold bull market. So everyone knows that derivatives have issues. We're seeing at the Federal Reserve level severe issues in the repo markets. In over 40% of all US debt right now is being refinanced in Cayman Island based upon a 101 highly leveraged basis trade that requires borrowing from the Bank of Japan, which is currently killing the carry trade. So we have in the US debt, 40%, the largest foreign purchaser of US debt is Cayman Island hedgies that are simply making a highly leveraged basis trade based upon borrowing from the Bank of Japan carry trade, and manipulating these ETFs arbitrage between these appointed reps. And guess what? Jane Street was also the one that is the appointed rep behind the silver ETF as well. So we know that there are significant paper contracts on all of these major commodities and fixed supply assets, and Bitcoin is the latest one. Those positions have to be covered. And we saw that the Fed switched from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. And there was significant action draining some of these repo markets, which is the overnight borrowing markets. We don't know who was on the wrong side of that silver trade. And that was a wild move. We do know that there was covert bailouts of banks and financial institutions, and they just didn't call it quantitative easing, because instead of buying these long-term treasuries, they were buying short-term bills. And so now if the Federal Reserve starts buying 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 week treasury bills, they don't call it quantitative easing. They only call it quantitative easing if it's the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year treasuries. And so we are in a quantitative easing environment. We're seeing that there has been bank bailouts. The operation to regime change the Federal Reserve in order to artificially push down rates is well underway. But now we've had this oil crisis and oil supply shock to add to the equation. So we're really seeing that in this transition to a multipolar world, commodities and fixed supply assets are the story. Derivatives are the mechanism. Money printing is the bailout. The losses are being socialized and the gains are being privatized. And in this whole phase, I personally believe that we will look back at this moment in history and realize this was the confiscation of as many Bitcoin from weak hands over to Wall Street. As we transition to this multipolar world where Bitcoin as a digital scarce asset will play an increasingly important role. But at the moment, central banks aren't buying it. You know, if you're selling your dollars and you're selling your treasuries, you're buying gold. They're not buying Bitcoin at the moment. And so it doesn't have this institutional central bank bid leading into this multipolarity. It's kind of correlated with a highly speculative AI tech stock at the moment. And guess what? AI is impacted by energy, So all Bitcoin is deeply integrated into the wider geopolitical situation right now. And I believe we've witnessed an operation to try and get as many people to sell their Bitcoin and centralize as much as possible. To me, that's a very bullish indicator if you're long term. It means they want Bitcoin. It means Bitcoin's important. It means that it's important enough to try and infiltrate. And I believe in the future is going to be a negotiation tactic between these currency wars that we're witnessing all around the world right now.
Why do you think we've seen such a strong run up in the gold price while Bitcoin has drawn down 50%?
Because we are in a de-dollarization phase. So last time we spoke, every single foreign stock market was outperforming the US stock market. There was massive capital outflows. The US stock market was being propped up by three things: money printing, transition from QT to QE, ETF inflows. So more and more people have this structural bid because they're just contributing to ETFs. And now BlackRock is just through the index funds, managing what gets access to constant capital through endowment funds, pension funds, insurance premiums. ETF flows are getting bigger and bigger and bigger because as markets get more complicated, people are just saying, "Hey, I'll just trade the index." So now you're essentially, handing over these structural bids, which means that BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and the financial industrial complex are able to effectively use index funds as a new weapon of mass destruction. So whether you're included or not included, you can rebalance. And so, and also media manipulation. So there is no concept of earnings per share. Historical things that financial analysts use in order to analyze the market has disappeared. So the stock market is dependent upon printing, ETF structural bids, and media manipulation. Media manipulation means that the only thing that matters is geopolitical strategic importance. AI is geopolitically and strategically important to FIC. The reason is because when the financial industrial complex in this multipolar world is trying to get a foothold in other countries as they're pushing capital out, they're using companies like NVIDIA in order to negotiate their terms. We'll build data centers in your country. We'll give you access to chips, and then we'll plug it into your cheaper energy. But we want X amount of sovereign wealth fund investment in our companies. And so you're starting to see that ETFs are becoming the new currency war. They're the new negotiation tactic. And the companies that survive are more about negotiation power And so then they just print money, use media manipulation, and get ETF inflows. And so many people, many investors are like capitulating, saying, this is a bubble. Like, I don't understand this. None of this makes sense anymore. The market is not the market. We are 100% centralized control by the financial industrial complex at this stage. So what are other countries doing? Other countries, the foreign ownership of US treasuries is going down and down and down because we've had these major currency wars in order to reset the world to multipolarity. We've had Bank of Japan increase their interest rates to break the Japan carry trade, which is why we've seen all this volatility in these paper contracts and derivatives markets. We've had Europe via NATO renegotiate the euro dollar, where Europe is effectively subsidizing US weapon purchases. And so the military industrial complex, which consists of assets mainly in America, but also France, UK, Germany, and Israel, those are the main military industrial complex stock markets. They get to print money in order to profit from war. And that needs to fuel those stock markets. And so the euro dollar, by creating this new relationship, effectively you're changing the dynamics where dollars can be printed via the European banks, via these FX derivatives swap contracts, which is facilitating propping up the US stock market and the military stocks, which requires more war in order to facilitate that trade. And this is being done in the Western Hemisphere. So America's going to dominate this part of the world with Europe, UK, Central South America, Canada, Greenland, various other parts. So in all of that, the US is now having to roll over its debt. So Japan now has the largest foreign holding of US treasuries, 1.8 trillion. If you break the carry trade, then right now we're seeing, and you create an oil crisis, they need to sell their treasuries as a potential tool. And we saw a massive intervention between the Fed and the Bank of Japan, where they were calling up their FX desks and trying to really, weaken the dollar and push up the value of the Japanese won. So we're seeing these major currency wars happening around this restructuring. And of course, the final part of that, euro dollar, Japan carry trade, is you need to break the petrodollar. And once you break the petrodollar, you then have all the currencies that pegged their currency to the dollar. They have to sell US treasuries or sell gold. They're not going to print their own currency. They can print their own currency, but in their reserves, if you're trying to maintain your currency's peg, so Saudi has a peg to the dollar, Hong Kong has a peg to the dollar. In order to defend the peg, you either sell US treasuries, US government debt, and if the value of the dollar is going down, then you're going to pick that. Or you have to, and what does selling US treasuries means? It means you're taking your US treasuries, you're selling them for dollars, and then you're using those dollars to purchase gold. And so gold is going up because the dollar was going down. And so we saw that when you price the dollar in foreign currencies, which is DXY, we were having a weakening and a weakening and a weakening. The gold was going up, silver was going up, which is a structural weakening, which is effectively a mechanism for breaking all of these everything that props up the dollar as world reserve currency. But they don't want to break anything. It's a managed transition. Mm-hmm. They make a lot of money. The FIC make a lot of money out of controlling the dollar and creating the dollar. But they need to hedge because they know that the world is changing and the collateral won't hold forever. So anyway, the largest holder, so China's been selling off its treasuries slowly. Japan has become the largest holder. Next to that is UK and Europe. And so they're being pushed into a financial crisis, which means that they'll have to sell their US treasuries in order to negotiate with some kind of IMF or austerity situation. So then you're left with who is going to buy the US treasuries?
Well, of course, it's the hedgies, it's Cayman Islands, and so it's the Jane Streets, it's the BlackRocks, it's them, and so you need pension reform, because what does Trump need to do? He wants to artificially push down the interest rate on the short-term debt to roll it over. So effectively, the strategy is, as the long-term debt is costing more, we need to keep refinancing shorter. And we need to artificially suppress the price. So who's going to pay negative yielding treasury? Who's going to buy negative yielding treasuries? You know, if inflation's going up, the longer term value is going up. Who's going to pay zero, these low percent? Well, pension reform. They need to dump in on the pensioners. They need to launch stable coins. And they need to create a mechanism for leaving the American people as the bag holders. And so the strategy right now is effectively print as much dollars as possible, switch from QT to QE, increase military budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, push the AI and data center trade, push the robotics trade, because eventually you're going to have structural unemployment that you need to deal with. Move to this 1984 Orwellian police state, surveillance state, technical industrial complex. That requires civil unrest. Make sure you're pushing the demographic changes, issues. Make sure you're fueling lots of tension across the West. And eventually, we're pushing towards having the UBI mechanism in order to roll over the debt, leave all the American people with the debt, and pump all that value into the stock market. And then you make sure that foreign markets and foreign currencies are outperforming the dollar and the S&P. And then that capital outflow allows you to guide via all the different country ETFs who gets access to capital as you reset the world order into multipolarity. And then you use that as the US military as a negotiation tactic, and you use the AI trade as a negotiation tactic to try and financialize and securitize as many foreign current countries as you can, penetrate as much as you can. You're seeing that with UAE for the Gulf countries. You're seeing that with India for BRICS. Penetrate as much as you can, knowing that you're not going to be able to control the dollar in the future. Eventually the money printer won't work and the collateral won't work. So you're managing all of that capital outflow, and every country knows that. So the central banks that are all members of the Bank for International Settlements that are sitting in Switzerland managing this trade, they're all selling their treasuries and buying gold. So the price of gold has gone through the roof. We had the initial pump, and then we had the correction leading up to the oil crisis. Then we had the strategic Venezuela war. Now we've got the Iran war. And to me, this is all part of a managed transition. Now, the reason why Bitcoin didn't go up is they didn't have enough Bitcoin. And so they built the derivative complex, and they created all sorts of media FUD to make people think Bitcoin's over. Epstein Files was a part of it. 1010 could have been a part of it. But we had all sorts of adverse media to make people sell their Bitcoin.
That seemed to be quite a coordinated thing. I don't know why they jumped. I mean, I guess Epstein was already, that's a big topic, right? And it was quite a hot topic before the war, and people seem to have I don't think people are going to let that go, that's for sure. And I know that the Trump administration would like people to forget about it. They're not going to forget about it, but it's on the back burner for now because there are more acute problems. But the way that everyone sort of latched onto that Epstein connection, which was not really, it was not really a strong connection. But let's break that down, because it's from what I can gather, it was a question of funding and the flow of funds and whether or not that had an influence on what Bitcoin became.
I did a lot of work to try and break it down for people, because I knew many of the developers, and I was a shareholder in many of the companies. So I had direct experience that people didn't have. On the surface, it was the perfect story. Anyone that hates Bitcoin, you say Jeffrey Epstein created Bitcoin. You pull out all these old clips of people saying, if you knew who created Bitcoin, you would sell it immediately and Bitcoin would go to zero. Like it was the perfect storm. You had all the shitcoiners like latching on. You had all the hard forks, the SV people, the B cashers and all that stuff. It was just the perfect frenzy in order to create mass selling pressure. So what do we know about the Epstein files? So I really dug deep. I interviewed Amir Toki because Amir Toki and Gavin Andreessen were the first two Bitcoin developers that Jeffrey Epstein, when the Epstein files were released, there was email evidence that they had contacted them. Amir Toki responded to me. I did a bit of an interview with him, asked him his experience on what actually happened there. And so Jeffrey Epstein originally contacted Bitcoin developers in 2011 via a Silicon Valley contact. And this contact, I forget his name now, was saying, if you want to meet the Bitcoin guys, these guys are a bit anarchist, they're a bit crazy. Fake emails were spread that that they making it out like Jeffrey Epstein was Satoshi. Those were complete fake ones. They weren't in there. But the 2011 came along and they wanted to find out, who were the Bitcoin people. Now, at that time, I remember because that was the year I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference and wrote that book on Bitcoin that year. Bitcoin was about $3 then. Amir Toki was a developer. He was launching an exchange. If you were around in 2011, the face of Bitcoin was people like Amir Toki, Gavin Andreessen, who was a developer. There was Roger Ver, who was an investor, and there was people like Eric Voorhees and Trace Mayer, who were creating startups with Charlie Schwem and people like that. Mm-hmm. So those were the faces in 2011. So he tried to contact Amir Toki. Amir Toki said that his business partner at one of the exchanges went to meet him in New York and ended up, he said, and I don't know whether it's true, but he said he thinks he ended up on the island. He came back and said, no, let's not take any funding. He's involved in pedo stuff, was his words. So that was attempt one that we understand. The Gavin Andreessen one is quite interesting because Gavin Andreessen was the first developer that Satoshi handed the project over to. He, if you remember, infamously lost his commit access to the GitHub repo when he was involved in a controversy around Dr. Craig Wright saying that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. And he was heavily involved in the block war debate. He was somebody that wanted to increase the block size. And there were different people like Mike Hearn from Google. And Gavin Andreessen allegedly didn't meet him, was the allegation. Gavin Andreessen's interesting because the timeline was Satoshi left the project when Julian Assange and WikiLeaks used it to counter the financial blockade. And then Gavin Andreessen said he's going to go meet with the CIA to discuss Bitcoin. And then after that, Satoshi left the project. And then Len Sassaman ended up, committing suicide allegedly, who I believe is Satoshi, the most likely candidate. That was all around the same time, like 1 month later. And then Gavin Andreessen said that he didn't meet Jeffrey Epstein. And then we get emails around about 2014 where Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were communicating around this whole concept of median of exchange, unit of account, store of value, and Jeffrey Epstein was effectively saying they're a bit confused. They don't know whether it's an asset or a currency. And Peter Thiel was like, oh, is this part of the I can't remember. I won't get the wording right. I can't remember what the wording, but something along the lines of, is this part of our discrediting campaign or a disinformation campaign or something like that? I put all the emails out there. Just can't remember the wording. But so Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were involved in what looked like conversations around how to weaponize big blocks, small blocks, store of value, unit of account, median of exchange, which became the block size war, effectively. Coinbase took some funding from Jeffrey Epstein via an introduction, via a third-party entity. Mm-hmm. That was brokered via a very controversial character called Brock Pierce. So Coinbase got some money. Gavin Andresen didn't meet him. And Brock Pierce came on the scene as what seemed like a facilitator of funding into Bitcoin companies. One of the companies was also Blockstream. Blockstream put together a bunch of Bitcoin core developers. They were heavily involved in the block size war debate. And then you had so you had Blockstream receive some funding. You had Coinbase receive some funding. You had attempts to meet with the core developers that didn't allegedly receive any funding. And then you had the introduction of Brock Pierce. Now, this coincides, the introduction of Brock Pierce to our industry. For those that you can look up his background, he's had controversial allegations around sexual misconducts with minors. He also was involved he was a child actor in Hollywood. We know that, putting things together in order to make it in Hollywood, you have to hang around with strange people and do strange things in general. No allegation there, but when you paint a bigger picture. And he blew up an internet startup during the .com boom and bust, and there were all sorts of Wolf of Wall Street style parties that blew up a bunch of money and led to those allegations around sexual misconduct and everything there. He settled his sexual misconducts, and then all the allegations went away. And then suddenly he was installed into an organization called the Bitcoin Foundation, which was effectively a mechanism for funding Bitcoin developers and being like a decentralized PR arm, but it had a foundation. And it was very controversial. But in 2014, once he joined, there was the arrest of Charlie Shrem. There was Mt. Gox went down and discredited Mark Capellas, who was on the board. Charlie Shrem behind BitInstant, who got arrested, he was on the board. We had Roger Ver, align with a new faction of scaling Bitcoin. And one by one, all of these controversial characters on the board were just kind of went down one by one. And he also paid a bunch of developers to create a digital dollar on the blockchain, which was called, I think, True Coin or Real Coin at the time. And it was later sold to Bitfinex and was rebranded as Tether. And so Brock Pierce installed Tether into our sector effectively. The Bitcoin Foundation was discredited. It went bankrupt after all of this discrediting. People pulled all their money and didn't want to contribute it anymore. And there was a funding crisis that led to looking for alternative ways to pay for developers. One of those was Blockstream emerged, so a private corporation that took one side of the block size war debate. And then I remember at the time, I was at a conference and Brock Pierce came up to me after my talk and said, "Simon, I've got to tell you something. And he spent approximately 2 to 3 hours trying to persuade me that this guy called Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. The chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation was a guy called John Matonis. John Matonis then comes out and says, "Hey, everybody, I know who Satoshi Nakamoto is." And Gavin Andresen also said, "I think he's Satoshi Nakamoto." So you have Brock Pierce pushing it in the back end. You have John Matonis introducing Dr. Craig Wright as Satoshi Nakamoto. And you have Gavin Andresen that, as infamously said, he got cryptographic proof that Satoshi Nakamoto, that Dr. Craig Wright, owned the Bitcoin keys. This was the movement that then Roger Ver joined, and a bunch of companies that wanted to increase the block size, and we entered into the block size war. And so this block size war was, so we had the introduction of stablecoins, which is the precursor for central bank digital currencies. Mm-hmm. We had Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein talking about a campaign to fracture Bitcoin around digital, unit of account, medium of exchange, and store of value. We had Brock Pierce facilitating investments into the divide and conquer strategy. And then we had the fracturing of the community, and Dr. Craig Wright. Then I remember I went to Shanghai at the time, and I met Jihan Wu, who's the founder of Bitmain, which is the company that was producing all the ASIC things for all the Bitcoin miners. And they got an investment from Sequoia Capital. And he was asking me about, Dr. Craig Wright. And he was also on the team of this guy's Satoshi. And so you had this very coordinated campaign to make everyone believe that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. The largest investor in the sector joined the movement. The largest mining ASIC manufacturer joined the movement. The head of the Bitcoin Foundation joined the movement. And all of the corporate entities that were coordinated via Barry Silbert, who created something called Digital Currency Group to fund all the Bitcoin companies. I was investing in all the Bitcoin companies. We created a fund with Max Kaiser called Bitcoin Capital. Brock Pierce created a fund called Blockchain Capital. And Barry Silbert created a fund called Digital Currency Group. We were investors in pretty much everything around that time. Then we had the divide and conquer strategy, the block size war. We were saved. And the end result of what happened during the block size war, I believe it was a coordinated divide and conquer campaign, where there was deliberate intervention in order to fracture the community and try and get a significant influence over that. And one of the strategies was to fork Bitcoin into a new Bitcoin. And that was done via Roger Ver, who owned Bitcoin.com, and then people thought that Bitcoin Cash was Bitcoin. And then you had, the futures market determine that, and we had to fight back with what's called a user-activated soft fork. The moral of the story is Bitcoin became much stronger at the end of this because we understood that while miners have power and the corporate entities and developers have power, the users also have power by running nodes. And so what's happening right now is that we're moving to the next phase of that battle, but we know exactly how it works. And so we know that Bitcoin became stronger, more decentralized as a result. And we know that triad of developers, miners, and node operators is what makes Bitcoin the most decentralized project in the world in its totality, but there were deliberate attempts to centralize every aspect. So if you increase the block size, you reduce the number of nodes, so you can centralize the number of nodes. That was the big block argument. In terms of the miners, you can attack the different ASIC manufacturers, and you can invest in those companies. We're seeing that now with all the public companies as well, and you can attack that side. And the developer side, you can create new companies, centralize a bunch of developers into a company, create a foundation, bankrupt a foundation. And what ended up happening is that the University MIT created a digital currency initiative. That digital currency initiative received some funding via a proxy of Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
And so Gavin Andreessen was one of the developers that received funding via DCI. So we can see that there were attempts, whether people know or not. I'm not making any allegations, but we can certainly see who the key players are. You had attempts to infiltrate every side of development, hard forks, central bank digital currencies, precursors, and Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Thiel seem to be key players. And Brock Pierce, I think, was one of the people that was providing utility to Jeffrey Epstein.
We should clarify, though, those investments that Epstein made indirectly into some of these companies were just a tiny, it was tiny compared to the amount that was being raised. It's not like anyone who invests in your company suddenly has a controlling stake in what your company does, or which direction it goes in, which products it develops, or policy positions it takes either. My understanding, it was something like 50 to 200,000, depending on which company. It wasn't, I wouldn't consider that a substantial amount of funding.
Yeah, it wasn't enough to gain influence and voting rights. But this is normally, a strategy that's used by
Sure.
Silicon Valley. It's
Yeah.
a feeder fund, and you try and gain more influence.
Mhm.
Eventually, you turn them into a public company, and then you have, voting right and significantly more influence when they need more funding in the future.
Yeah, I mean,
But Coinbase,
I've seen some people make sort of connections where a relatively small financial transaction through an investment, sometimes through an intermediary, and then they say, "Oh, such and such owns this company, therefore the guilt by association is that whatever this person stands for, in this instance, it's Epstein, that the associated company that received that small investment is suddenly guilty by association." But it just doesn't work that way. I mean, it's not like a drop of salt water contaminates everything, right? In a freshwater bucket, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, there's way more nuance, than the headline.
Yeah.
Within a corporate governance structure, you have executives. Executives work for the board. The board are appointed by shareholders. And the more shares you have, the more influence you have in influencing the board and therefore the executives.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have funds which work off a limited partner structure. So there'll be lots of other investors in there, or potentially 100, depending on how it's structured. And so you've got, a fund investing in a company.
Mm-hmm.
They will have a governance structure. There'll be a governance structure here. And as the company gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that would be diluted further and further, depending on if they continue to invest. Blockstream said, and I'm just talking what they said, said they divested him later.
I saw that Adam posted that in response.
But the one thing Adam hasn't talked about was that there was a scheduling that said that he visited Jeffrey Epstein in the island. And he hasn't responded to that.
Mm-hmm.
He did talk about the funding of Blockstream. And now he's launching a Bitcoin treasury company, and he pushes Bitcoin treasuries. He's taken a deliberate stance on one side of the spam debate that's happening right now. He pushes stable coins. And I think he's put a bunch of Bitcoin. So look, just take that information as you were. The most important point here is that the reason I really like where we're going right now is because we're developing competing implementations of nodes, technology to make Bitcoin mining pools more decentralized, where you can change the parameters. All of that is really good stuff. And we've already seen that we've had developers that have given up commit access as a result of pressure from the community. These are really positive developments.
Hang on, have they given up commit access, or have they just walked away from Bitcoin development in totality?
Gloria is one of those people. Yeah. She walked away. She doesn't have commit access anymore.
Okay, well, if you campaigned for that, right? So I've seen the commentary on Twitter. You might consider that a success. On the flip side of that, are we pushing away people who may have done some good work and perhaps deterring other people from even trying?
I think the very fact that we're having this debate is what Bitcoin's meant to be. It's a decentralized boardroom. Your opinion matters. And actually, at the end of the day, the only people that matter, and this is the key message, the only people that matter right now are the node operators, if you're an individual person. So what I encourage everyone, that this is really healthy. If you want to vote in this debate, you need to have Bitcoin in self-custody, and you need to be running a node, and you need to be, verifying your own transactions and running a full implementation or backup of the blockchain.
Well, my understanding of the whole thing, I try to stay away from these political debates, but my understanding is that what's motivated a good deal of the people who are on the not side of things is they feel like that they were completely dismissed because they weren't part of the developer community, and so that their opinions don't matter. And I think that riled up a lot of people.
I agree. And I think it's a genuine debate. There's a lot of narrative around. I do think that Core have made some bad decisions as a result of the community kind of thinking, let's leave them to it right now. We went through a phase where most people were really focused on treasury companies, ETFs, institutional, and we forgot to focus on what's happening on the developer side. And I think we went so far off that the Core made some decisions that many people considered bad decisions in terms of the last few upgrades.
Mm-hmm.
And there were things that one could consider as bad faith or good faith, depending on your understanding of how they did it. Now, this brought right back to the surface. Okay, we need to focus on what's important. Keeping Bitcoin decentralized, pressure on core, competing implementations, being able to set parameters. And I think Bitcoin's a whole lot stronger as a result of this. And we also have a new attack vector that we need to test, which is what happens when you have a minority that want to do a soft fork. And is it activated by miners? And is there a resistance from the node operators? And we get to learn more. And then what is the reaction to that? They're trying to get a miner activated soft fork that can then be a user activated soft fork. We need to have that attack, because if that attack exists within what I consider the good actors in the community, it will be implemented by a bad actor, whether it's a Jane Street or a BlackRock or a JP Morgan at some point. So we go through that next battle. We learn what happens. It's an open source boardroom, and people need to run nodes and self-custody, and they need to understand a bit more about Bitcoin. We've had developers that have left. That's good. But the most important thing is this is an open source boardroom, and this is incredibly healthy, and it's made Bitcoin stronger.
Well, that's what I thought, that people sensed that they weren't part of that discussion in the dismissive nature of, I guess, some people around core.
Yeah, absolutely.
The dismissive nature in which they dealt with that feedback was like, well, you haven't committed anything, so fuck off.
Yeah, and the one thing I learned as well is that I didn't realize how many changes had happened in core developers. But then it got me back looking at GitHub and saying, who has commit access now? Right, these people are radically different. What is their ideology? What do we know about them? And so to me, it reignited making sure that we're looking at, as a hardcore Bitcoiner, it's up to us, right? The easy Bitcoiners, the vast majority is just going to be left to Bitcoin ETFs and all that stuff. But we need a core community, pardon the pun, cure, that are really holding developers account, engaging in this, running nodes and holding it in self-custody.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have that, Bitcoin's pointless. We need to hold Wall Street to account, and we need to maintain that. And that energy has come back. And it was because of controversies, and decision making. Are we turning Bitcoin into Ethereum? People were like, hold on, what's going on here? What's the second and third degree impact there? And then that turns into a narrative war. And then people start throwing daggers at each other and misrepresent things. And then people start questioning, is he compromised? Is he an agent? And then people start looking into everyone's background, and maybe there's something that comes there. So all of this it's painful to watch because it's so against human nature. But it's what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin, and it's a very positive development.
So Gloria Zhao, the core dev that we were talking about a moment ago, she said that she's not particularly interested in the political or economic ideology behind Bitcoin. She was interested in it from a technological point of view, and that's what motivated her to do, commit herself to do all the work in Bitcoin. What's wrong with that?
Well, people just built perceptions that she was optimizing for turning Bitcoin into Ethereum. And then they started to look at her character, and they started to make ideological assessments around wokeness or, things like this. And then personality comes into the equation. And then you have narrative on X and Twitter. And then we had some actions that were very, very questionable in terms of, blowing up the op return. I don't want to go into that. It's not too much. And then people ask whether it's good faith or bad faith, and this is future vision. And are we turning Bitcoin into Ethereum? And people thought that Core was doing that. And then they needed to explain themselves. And they just say, well, spam is happening on Bitcoin anyway, and we think it should go in a trash can rather than this way. There was connections. From my perspective, Peter Todd has a background, which I think is personally questionable in terms of his connections to compromise and email leaks and history.
Specifically?
So if you remember, there was a bunch of email links, and there was someone called John Dillon that was an agent connected to the CIA, and they had a whole communication back and forth around him doing work for John Dillon. Amir Toki said that Peter Todd, he thinks he was compromised, so there's people that have questions. Personally, as a personality, I don't like Zionists that push for nuclear weapons. I don't think that's aligned and blowing up countries. And so to me, I have some problem with that. And also he's pushed out that he'd like to increase the number of Bitcoin, which is obviously, we know, something that would never happen. So people question, these decisions. And Peter Todd had they had relationships across these developers, and then people start to question, is there compromise here? And she made the decision that either because of the pressure or something, she wanted to leave. But it also is good. It's very good to rotate people. We need to demonstrate that there's no key person risk here.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it turns out that people can leave, people can go, and there is a process and pressures applied, that's very healthy. Like we can't have any key person risk in Bitcoin development.
We started off just this part of the conversation talking about the Epstein Association FUD, and I just want to tie the knot on that thread before we move on. As far as I can tell, it was really just some minor investments in a couple of rounds of funding for a number of companies. But he never really had any kind of influence over the operation of those companies, the appointment of people, any kind of policy influence at all. It seemed to me like an attempt to get involved in Bitcoin that was rather unsuccessful.
Yeah, he wanted to try and get involved in Bitcoin. He wanted to make money as an investor. He probably wanted to use Bitcoin. So my overarching theory is that if you look at Len Sassaman, who I think was one of the people that was Satoshi Nakamoto, I think that Bitcoin was a offshoot of DigiCash. And that was shut down because the bank shut it down and they didn't want privacy. Therefore, we had this next iteration. And Len Sassaman at a university in Netherlands worked under David Chom. I think they open sourced Bitcoin, and it was an offshoot of intelligence. But it wasn't meant to be open sourced. That was a resistance against what they were trying to create. And why they were trying to create it is because I believe that now we're hitting the phase, Clarity Act and Genius Act, where effectively this was meant to be a gateway drug for a central bank digital currency to get the world on this digital rails to create programmable money in a surveillance state and a universal basic income. I think that there was a higher level financial operation. I think Bitcoin came from it. I think it was open sourced. And then I think there was lots of attempts to infiltrate every area of the open source part of it, which ended up making Bitcoin stronger. And none of them succeeded. And no one controls every element of it. And so I think Peter Thiel was part of a bad actor operation in a divide and conquer operation. I think Craig
just
Wright
break that down for us, because Peter Thiel's a really interesting character. He has a lot of government contact. He's very close to government. He's one of the founding investors in Palantir, which we know is a government contractor that's embedded from intelligence surveillance point of view. They say they do big data, but it's come to light how their application is being used to actually kill people. And now their CEO openly says that's the feature of their product, to keep the nation safe, so to speak. So let's just break down what his involvement is, because primarily he's a venture capital investor in technology space.
So Peter Thiel, I believe, was compromised into utilizing Silicon Valley into the types of networks that Jeffrey Epstein's involved in. If you look across the PayPal mafia, as it were, the three important characters that have emerged is Elon Musk, David Sacks, and Peter Thiel. Now let's have a look at what they're doing. So Elon Musk was DARPA funded, which is defense contractor funded. relies upon Pentagon budgets for his technology, and has been given an incredible amount of military grade technology that he got to call his own, and ended up with a company called Tesla that somebody else created. And we're led to believe that he's the richest man in the world, that plays video games all day, tweets on X all day, is involved in regime changes all day, and has created spaceships, electrical cars, bought X, which he was allowed to buy because he borrowed against his net worth. And basically is also creating electric houses. Just so you know, my Tesla, when I started tweeting the wrong thing, my Tesla doesn't work anymore. I have a Tesla that I can't even use anymore or open the door anymore.
What?
Yes.
Come on.
I have a Tesla that I can't open the door.
So when you say the wrong things, now you've been an outspoken advocate for Palestinians. Are we talking specifically since October 7 and the Gaza massacre genocide?
Yeah, since that, I'm not connecting the dots, and
Okay.
it could be completely coincidental, but I'm just putting it out there that I have a Tesla that stopped working and doesn't let me open the door anymore, and it's stuck on an island, and we don't have a Tesla place, and so I'd have to actually tow that across an island in order to try and figure out how to do it. But I can't open the door anymore.
But that's interesting. Another data point to that, and I don't know if this is. I don't know how true this is. I don't know if it's a quirk of data. I don't know if it's just a bug in Google searches. But there was an article that came out last week that a bunch of people who authenticated their IDs through X, Elon Musk's platform, Twitter. He uses an Israeli company called Authentics, right? So what you need to do is you've got to submit official government identification, passport, birth certificate, driver's license, that sort of thing, right? And a lot of people suddenly reported that their full names were being searched in Israel, specifically Israel. Now, that got me curious because, Bitcoin Archive is a business of mine. I'm not anonymous. People, and I have a very unique name, which is not Archie, right? So Archie is what I'm known as. I have a very unique birth name, and the combination of my first and last name, it's one of one. But there are searches of it in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and specifically, that in and of itself is it's no particular interest. But it started with the Iran war. Coincidentally, when I reactivated my Radar Hits account, that suddenly started posting about the Iran war because it was of huge interest, right? It's a general news and current affairs account. So I started posting on that account. And then since that I started posting, there were searches at various levels of volume from Israel only for my full name. Nobody searches for my full name. Nobody. Like there's zero in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, is that just a quirk of data? What's going on there? Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, there's all sorts of things.
Right? So has Elon Musk knowingly or unknowingly funneled the entire verified user base of Twitter into an Israeli honeypot that has surreptitiously siphoned all those details for the use of the Israeli government for intelligence purposes?
Yeah.
Right? That's a real question for me now, because why would anybody be searching for my name, which nobody knows, by the way, and why would they be searching for my name in Israel?
And remember, if you look at the Gaza rebuild plan, there's an Elon Musk data center that's being built in Gaza as part of the plan.
Is that real?
That's real.
Or is that just like
No,
they
that's
want
real.
to put his name in there and Jared Kushner wants a bit of, put some big names, get some clout around the program?
Whatever reason is
Right.
there.
It's there. Okay.
We also know that, do you remember when I think it was obviously there was the Doge thing.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big data collection exercise.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
remember the X account, Department of Homeland Security. As soon as, do you remember Elon released the thing where it said,
it was domiciled in Israel.
It was domiciled in Israel, and then they changed it to United States in the next version.
Yeah.
But if you remember, if you look back at the history of Elon, so firstly, he is, in my opinion, a military contractor. He's given technology and he gets to privatize it for the financial industrial complex. He's fully subordinate to finance. His net worth is dependent upon high leverage. And so if they want to destroy his net worth, they can just use that through derivatives. They can destroy his net worth through derivatives overnight if they want. So he's fully subordinate to a typical captured structure. He also is now launching X. I think it's Tesla houses. So if you can't afford a house, $7,000, you get a fully electric house. And if they want to keep you in it, lock the door just like they can lock my car. He's also turning X into an everything app like WeChat, launching X Money. That will probably be a stable coin, fully programmable money. And X is getting closer and closer to a social credit score. Look at the history. If you look back at early Elon Musk comments around Hamas and various other things, he used to say, look, if you kill Palestinians, you're probably going to end up with 10 times more Israelis killed or something to that effect.
No, he said what you're doing is you'll get the blowback because you're going to motivate their remaining friends and families to seek revenge as a result of that. That was the gist of what he was saying.
Yeah, so he was talking like a normal person, right? Mm-hmm. With a normal opinion. Then he acquires X, which was fully leveraged. So the financial industrial complex gave him X, which comes with terms and conditions. Which is the backdoor needs to be used for military grade. You get the regime change with Jack Dorsey. Jack Dorsey was complying, ended up censoring Trump. And then we get the regime change. And then Elon creates a highly leveraged bet. Who provided the funding? The financial industrial complex and Gulf sovereign wealth funds. They provide all that.
Okay. Now, I love the way you join dots, but I have to push back on a little bit so that conversation gets a little bit more interesting, right? I think before Elon took over Twitter and then renamed it X, it was firmly a tool of the deep state and the Democratic Party in particular. When he came in and he exposed the back-end operations of that sort of joint cooperation to censor, suppress. Why would he do that if what you say is true then? Why would he expose the operations and then give light to all of, the dirty laundry of the military industrial complex, the democratic political machine? Why would he do all of that if he was then a tool of the military industrial complex, financial industrial complex?
In my opinion, because the model changed. So COVID, all of that stuff was the censorship model. Oppress data, cancel culture. Then they cancelled many of the key podcasters and turned them. So then the podcasters suddenly became completely different in terms of their messaging. The large podcasters were all turned in the cancel phase. They started interviewing all these ex-CIA assets and just doing propaganda for
that happened. I've seen an influx of former intelligence operatives become podcasters or very prominent podcast guests. And a couple in particular have very, very big followings now on the podcast platforms.
Yeah. So then Elon comes along, we get a regime change, Twitter becomes X. Freedom of speech platform. Everyone gets excited. Censorship is over. So everyone goes over to X. Everyone starts talking. Oh, wow, I can say whatever I want. Then the regime changed. There was a whole load of tweets about Hitler and various other things, and Nazism started to go wild. And to this day, there is a very large community on X in every faction of extreme Nazism. Blame everything on the Muslims, blame everything on the Jews. Like all of those different factions have now been galvanized into X communities and algorithms. Then we had a change, right? Do you remember there was the whole H-1B visa thing?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone started going nuts. You said you're going to be focused on America first. And
that
now,
was the first split in MAGA that I sort of really took, like a real massive split. I think it was a big issue. Yeah.
And then Silicon Valley wanted to hire all the Indian companies to build all the AI to replace all the American developers, and clearly, that was the first thing. Elon goes nuts. Then the agenda changed. This was also around the time that Elon had to go kiss the wall in Israel and go visit Auschwitz and give a softball interview to Netanyahu to spread propaganda. And suddenly you remember he had to go to Congress when Netanyahu came to visit. Everyone was clapping like seals. He looked like a hostage. Yes, I'm going to go see Netanyahu. And so, we had a complete regime change around that time as well. What did everything change to? It changed to freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. What does that mean? That means we're going to decide what to boost, but we want you to talk. You talk. I want to know exactly who you are. We're not going to censor you. We're going to allow you to say whatever you want. But in order for us to boost you, you have to play with the rules. And the rules are, this is what we want to boost. And so change your language to be more sensational, be more extravagant, be more parabolic. If you're doing genuine analysis, you don't get much. If you're being really parabolic, you get boosted. Mm-hmm. So now we're building our social credit score, which is say everything. I want to know who you are really. Mm-hmm. We will only boost the traffic that says what we want you to say. And you're going to end up with a social credit score while we launch X Money and the Everything app. And now we're going to have to do suspicious activity reports, and we integrate it with Grok. And so now you got AI telling you the truth, what we want you to believe to be the truth. You've got a dumbed down people that are asking Grok for everything. We're entering into a phase where we don't know what's true and what's not with deep fakes. So we're asking Grok what's true. Is that video real? Is that not real? And it's not even good at telling you whether or not something is real. It's incredibly unreliable. I would say it's got less than a 20% hit rate of verifying something accurately as being truthful or not. It's just horrible. And under every single post, you see like half a dozen to a dozen people reflexively just asking Grok to tell them what's real. Then he flooded it with data, Epstein files, all these different controversies. Suddenly we're all talking about everything. We're exposing the deep state, and we're allowed to talk about it. Suddenly we've got people that are like on the most extreme side of discussing everything that you could never discuss. Mm-hmm. So now all communities are galvanized. All the cancelled people came back. Alex Jones is back. Candace Owens allowed to talk about Zionism. Mm-hmm. Tucker Carlson is anti-Israel all of a sudden. His intelligence connections as well. And suddenly Nick Fuentes is uncancelled. And so you get all of the most, all of these different things, and they are just compartmentalizing everybody into boxes, feeding you the extremist version of your belief and giving you freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach, while they go into an everything app. And once you're a financial services provider, you have to report suspicious activity reports based upon your understanding of a person. You're not going to, if you've got all the social data and the financial services platform, and somebody's talking about the extremist of things, then only AI could pick that up. So AI is going to be filing the suspicious activity reports. This is going to then build the data that determines whether you can borrow, and it's going to be integrated into your car that can be switched off, your house that can be closed, and all the back end of the data and the KYC is using Israeli companies. Which was a switch that they made around the time of the regime change. And then Netanyahu starts bragging about how, we got TikTok and we got X. Elon what did he do? He was involved in the regime change operation in Venezuela. He started pushing Tommy Robinson to create civil unrest in the UK. He did the same in Brazil. And so now he is a tool of 100% the deep state. That's just Elon Musk.
But hang on, we're talking about a transformation here, right? But Why do you think that transformation happened at a particular point?
Well, I think they realize that the censorship model is breaking. We're now moving to AI, and we need data.
Okay, but I'm specifically talking about Elon, because we started on Elon Musk, right? You said at one point he was talking like a normal person based on, I think he was talking about October 7th. It might have been in the early months after that. And then you laid out this kind of transformation where you're saying that he's enacting the agenda of the military-industrial complex and the deep state, right?
I think
What happened? What do you think happened that brought about a change?
I think he was there from day one.
Okay.
I think the PayPal mafia were the chosen people. So you had Elon Musk that was effectively the data transition to this carbon credit world and electricity grids and AI and all that stuff. Then you had David Sachs. He was appointed by the Trump administration to do stablecoins and AI, Genius Act, Clarity Act, all that type of stuff. By the way, these are all guys that knew each other from South Africa, then came to PayPal, created the PayPal mafia, somehow defied the banking system, and ended up rich and investing in Silicon Valley stuff or creating the next wave of military technologies. And then you had Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel ended up creating Palantir, which is the military AI play. Palantir did genocide as a service in Gaza, occupation as a service in West Bank, military-grade drone technology in Ukraine, crowd control for the annual Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia, the Department of Defense and pre-crime beta tests in the UK for arresting people based upon social media posts, NHS data, health data, Doge data, which was integrating all different departments of the US into one database. They're doing border control in America, integrated with ICE, in terms of helping ICE pick who the immigrants are. Integration with the privatized prison sector in America and the national prison sector in El Salvador. Education in El Salvador. We got Palantir and X with all of these ones. You know, all of these different, all of the European civil unrest campaigns, they're all getting contracts with Palantir. So now you've got social credit scores, stable coins, AI, the transition of the West into its box, the Western Hemisphere. The military can't make profits after they do their final operations that we're witnessing right now. So they need to make up for lost profits at home. And they've got their agents that are fully subordinate to the financial industrial complex to make up for military profits in the Western Hemisphere. So they're bringing all the tactics that they did around the global South and bringing them back home. And that requires the extremist version of you that hates people. And so you all get angry at each other so that you can have what they're building in Gaza. A 15-minute technocratic, freedom city, they're calling it in America. Smart city, they're calling it in other places. And you need something extreme to happen in order to make people scared.
So what do you make of their CEO, Alex Karp, who's Mr. fentanyl-laced urine drone that he wants to deploy onto journalists?
He's your typical psychopathic fake entrepreneur that serves an agenda and works in compromise circles, that is addicted to drugs and all sorts of activities because what he has to do in life.
Do you think he's on something? On his interviews, he has this hyperactive nature that just does not seem normal to me.
Yeah, I mean, he looks like he's on cocaine. That's how I interpret it. These are the psychopathic people that are given military grade technology. This is the transnational private sector that's controlled by the financial industrial complex, and they can regime change any entrepreneur if they get out of line. They've got board seats on 20,000 companies at BlackRock now. This whole thing that we think is called capitalism in the West is fully captured. And governments are completely subordinate to it. They've captured the Senate. They've captured the Congress. They've blackmailed the judicial. They've captured all the corporate interests. And your gateway drug is via Silicon Valley into private equity and venture capital, into public company, into corporate debt, into, if you are compromised all the way up, then you need to hang out with the other 1,000 Jeffrey Epsteins that exist out there. And the higher you want to go, if you want Donald Trump's role, you have to be fully subordinate and fully compromised. Trump came from the Roy Cohns, Charles Kushner, blackmail rings. He made his money in New York, hanging around with mob members like Steve Witkoff and other real estate tycoons. And these are the people running our country, our countries that are running the West, and they're losing. And the financial industrial complex is saying, "Hey, let's scrape as many assets as we can out of the West, and now we need to, we need to reset the order." And so that brings us to the Iran war. Most people think that US, Israel, and Iran are in a war. If this were a genuine war, the price of gold would have been through the roof with oil. If it's closed for 2 months and the price of oil hits 150 or above, we're in global financial crisis, recession, just worse than 2008. Everything breaks. You have to crash the price of oil, and you need to have done it yesterday. That's reality. And the only way to do that is to have a deal. The second the strait is open again, we are in a completely different world. The big print is coming. There is no alternative but big print after this. The West is going to get worse and worse. US empire is over officially today.
Archie.
So about 17 days ago, the United States, led by the nose, followed Israel into an attack on Iran. Let's start with why.
Okay, so last time we did a podcast, I talked about FIC-MICTIC, financial industrial complex, asset managers, investment banks, private equity, venture capital, retail banks that create fiat currencies. MIC, Palantir, cybersecurity operations, big industrial
military
weaponry,
industrial complex. That's,
UK, Germany, France, Israel, American corporate interest, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, BAE Systems, all those types of things. Technical industrial complex, the big magnificent seven, algorithms, data, X, Palantir, all that stuff. Right. Those are the three powers that control the West. And they want leverage over other countries that may be more sovereign. Those countries are sovereign if they manage to keep a central bank that genuinely optimizes for their own people, like the People's Bank of China. They manage to keep their resources away from the IMF, and they put it into a sovereign wealth fund. Those are the three components of sovereignty at the corporate level. Central bank that's optimized for your people, resources that are optimized for your people, and a sovereign wealth fund that allows you to negotiate with the financial industrial complex and persuade them not to kill you or assassinate you or regime change you, or take your resources or take you to a forever war or whatever the MIC want to do. Okay, so most people think that right now there is a war between US, Israel, and Iran. I personally believe there is a power struggle between MIC and FIC and TIC. So who are the MIC? I think the best way to understand the Iran war is by studying what we know from declassified documents. There are two very important declassified documents that help us understand the Iran war. One is Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was the overthrowing of the democratically elected government in Iran for British Petroleum, which was executed by the CIA and MI6 in 1953. And this was all around. British Petroleum was receiving 80% of all the oil, and Iran was allowed to keep 20%. And when later there was a democratically elected government that wanted to nationalize the oil, they needed to install their own puppet government, which was the Shah. And so what did they do? They created civil unrest in the country. They did a currency war in order to destroy the value of the currency. They then used sanctions in order to make it economically very dissatisfying for the people because of that. They then paid the media to create stories around the leadership, and then they killed people and shot people and said it was the leader. And then they weaponized the media, civil unrest, sanctions, and currency war in order to create an uprising. And then a military coup would then combine, and then they would regime change, overthrow the government with a puppet and a Democrat and a dictator. And they had to use all the resources for British Petroleum. And it was a joint operation between the CIA and MI6 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that helps you understand Operation Ajax. I think we witnessed Operation Ajax 2.0 before this war. Same tactics. Then look at the Iran-Contra affair, which was in the 70s and 80s. So 79, 80s. So Khomeini, the grand leader, was in exile in France. And then suddenly there was an uprising that was agitated by intelligence that led to hostage taking of US hostages and a negotiation. Many years later, it was revealed via the Iran-Contra documents that effectively US was sending money to Israel. Israel was purchasing weapons from the military-industrial complex and then giving those weapons to the IRGC and the Revolutionary Guard. And then they were trafficking. They could say it was them, it wasn't us, trying to blame it on the IRGC. And they were trafficking those weapons to Central and South America, to Nicaragua, and funding the Contras, which was a militia group that was ensuring that the CIA got access to all their drug trafficking routes. And it was done via Credit Suisse as the money laundering bank. So Iran, US, and Israel were working together around the time of the hostage taking. And then what did America do? Well, they gave chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And then they agitated a war between Iraq and Iran. And that built what we know as the IRGC's military-industrial complex today. Prior to that, Israel, after the 67 war, was obviously always an outpost for US military. So then you start seeing things like the revolution. You get the construction of the Islamist terrorist narrative. Later, we have Saudi intelligence working with CIA to create Wahhabi Islamic ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and to take down the towers, in that CIA, Mossad, Saudi intelligence hub.
Just a point. It had already, that school of, religious theology was already created, but they started propagating and weaponizing that throughout the world at the time that you're talking about.
They infiltrated and created a cult and do what they've always done, which is you create a bunch of people that don't know the religion that join a cult and they're told what their religion is. And then their religion is they're told that they're in a holy war and a jihad and various other things. Mm-hmm. And so then you create a terrorist factory, which is a book you can read about, Terrorist Factory. You can read about covert regime changes, all of these different, takes all the CIA documents and help you understand it. Read a book called Operation Gladio by Paul Williams. It talks about this concept of strategic tension. Strategic tension is you fund both sides of opposing sides, and you continually make sure they're fighting each other. Okay. You never allow them to destroy the infrastructure, but you create divide and conquer so they can never unify. And then the easiest thing to weaponize is religion. So you create the evangelical radicalized Christians in America. You create the Jews that are radicalized into Zionism, give me back my land. And you create the quote unquote Islamist terrorist, based upon these misinterpretations of the Quran and hadiths and various scripture. Okay, so these are very complicated operations that they create. The idea was that you have one side saying death to America, death to Israel. You have another side that says, come join the IDF because the Jews need you, and engage in the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians. Another side, Saudi, after King Faisal, remember he was assassinated because after the Unipolar War in 1973, he basically did an oil blockade embargo that pushed the price of oil up. Then later he was assassinated, and then George Bush created the Safari Club with the regime change, Saudi Arabia, that started all of these operations that led to Twin Towers, Al-Qaeda, all this type of stuff. In Iraq, they immediately got them to fight each other. They gave one side chemical weapons, the other side. So you created strategic tension across the Middle East. Then in 1973, this led to the creation of the petrodollar. So now you prop up the dollar via...
Just explain. The petrodollar was the agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia that Saudi would only sell oil denominated in US dollars.
Exactly, yeah.
And then that would be funneled into US treasuries.
And then when you end up with excess dollars, you don't hold them in a bank. You buy US treasuries to lend to the US government. The currency strengthens. You lend more to the government, and then they can further their military industrial complex to fund more covert operations to take over more parts of the world.
And just one more point, because it's going to be relevant later on. And in return, so Saudi Arabia sells their oil for printed money, and then they use that money to buy US treasuries, which is essentially US government debt.
Yeah.
In return for a security guarantee. Basically, not necessarily of the country, but more or less of the monarchy to remain in power.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so then they get a US base in their country that provides them the defense, and they have to spend some of that money on the military industrial complex, and they lend the rest back through the financial industrial complex. They then build up all this dollar wealth because America also needs to buy oil. And so America gets its energy, Saudi gets its defense. And if you're holding your reserves in dollars and the value's going up because it's continually going up, then you're okay and you continue to do that. And this effectively was a mechanism for enforcing demand for the dollar and rolling over the debt-based Ponzi scheme of the American empire. They did several relationships like this, but to keep it simple, you had effectively strategic tension in the Middle East and the propping up of the petrodollar. You had 40 years of media narrative. The radical extremists are about to get a nuclear bomb. And so Israel continually provides that narrative. They want to kill the Jews. We need to keep getting defense. America, give us $3 billion, give us $10 billion. And they would strategically keep mowing the lawn in Palestine. Remember, and then what would Iran do? Iran would try and get leverage by funding different militia groups in different countries. So they did Yemen with the Houthis. They did Hezbollah in Lebanon after the 1982 war. They did the Hamas in Gaza. And then they had different militias in Iraqi interests after the Iraq war. After the Iraqi invasion. And then obviously they had all the Syria, which was just a big mess. I don't even want to go in those. Moving a lot of history, but let's get to where we are. What was the key thing? Trump administration 1, fracking. America becomes energy independent. They now produce their oil and they produce their LNG, and they're now exporters. Like they're selling oil and they're selling gas. Okay, so we don't need to buy anything from Saudi anymore. So what does Saudi do? Saudi and the Gulf countries, they say, well, let's invest in your Texas oil refiners and Texas LNG and infrastructure. And so the Gulf countries invest and build up America's own refiners and their own industry. Now they're competitors. So they have to hedge their bet by owning those companies. And so they own a bunch of the infrastructure. No one can, America can produce oil at like $40. Saudi can do it at like $2 to $10. China's got the manufacturing base, but now America's not buying any of the oil and gas. Who is buying the gas? The manufacturing base. So China basically is buying Venezuelan oil, Gulf countries oil, Iranian oil, Guyanan oil, anywhere they can get oil from or gas from. Simultaneously, they're building out the largest infrastructure for alternative and renewable energy, wind farming, solar farming, everything they can, hydro farming, like every type of energy. America's becoming a gambling tool, collateralized debt obligation. The people are all in debt. The corporates are all loaded up with corporate debt, which means they're owned by FIC. And the government is 100%, $40 trillion in debt, coming. So FIC owns the government, the corporate entities, and the people. And now 92% of the value of the stock market is owned by 10% of the people. And those 10% of the people are propping up the whole consumption of the economy, unless you can give people more debt. And so people start spending on credit cards, people start getting auto loans, people start getting debt on burritos. Like they're borrowing to buy food.
Yeah,
like literally.
That's quite an unbelievable thing. Like just to see that option when you're buying something online is, do you want to split this payment into over 3 months? And it's like literally a burger.
So the dollar's going up in value. They're printing more and more money because the government is a collateralized debt obligation for corporate interest. That's causing inflation. The cost of living's going up, and they're supplementing more and more Americans are supplementing their consumption habits with debt. And so they create subscription services for everything. You don't own anything. You will own nothing and be happy. World Economic Forum says, screw it. You don't need cars. Just rent your car. Just use Uber. You don't need houses. That's just for the rich. You get a tiny electric house, or you become the renter. You become the serfs. Okay. And so this is getting worse and worse and worse. Meanwhile, in America, suicide rates are up, drug addiction's up. Those drug routes are still protected by the CIA and the cartels. Every time you want a war, you pretend you're taking on drugs. Anytime you want oil, you pretend you're taking on terrorism. Anytime you want some other type of rare earth resources, you pretend you're taking on communism, and you just create narrative that radicalizes all the American people to think you're, while things are getting worse and worse and worse, but they can't quite put it together, and so they're turning to drugs. Women are turning to OnlyFans for jobs. Men are addicted to pornography. Men and women hate each other. Birth rates are collapsing. And where are all the birth rates? They're still in Africa. They're in these the highest birth rates are in the Middle East and Africa. So the companies and the World Economic Forum and the Davos class are saying, kind of got everything we can here. China's the manufacturing base. Middle East is the oil. America's, getting more and more degenerate. What are we going to do next? Let's destroy Europe. Blow up Nord Stream pipeline. Agitate a war via NATO and CIA with Russia. Make them energy independent. Make them energy dependent upon US. And Qatar does a deal. They get to import some of their energy from Qatar, and Qatar invests in infrastructure in the US. So now you've got, but you've got all Chinese money propping up the sovereign wealth funds and the energy companies, and then they're buying US equities, and they become the source of capital for America. Because all of Americans, all their money is being managed by BlackRock via ETFs and pension funds and endowments. They're all in debt, so they're a product of the banks. You've basically taken the entire America and made it 70% service-based, 30% goods. And now America can't produce an F-35 fighter jet or a drone or a missile without China. And the American nuclear weapons buy highly enriched uranium from Russia. and they decide to wage a covert war on Russia. What happens to Europe? They lose their energy. Then they say, BlackRock comes out and says ESG.
Well, specifically, they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline so that Russia couldn't sell energy into Europe.
Yeah, so you could destroy the manufacturing base of Germany. Germany required cheap energy to build it, to have a manufacturing base. You take away cheap energy, you've got no manufacturing base. No manufacturing base, that destroyed Europe is effectively big Germany. And the European Union is a product of the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. And so the European Union has these unelected officials that work for the Bank for International Settlements that effectively do nothing but print money and give it to Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, the military industrial complex. They implement policy that destroys energy. Even in the UK, what was the thing we did? We decide in our infinite wisdom, and I can't put this down to stupidity. I can put this down to capture, but not stupidity. We decide to do a windfall tax on the North Sea oil energy structure that destroys all of the North Sea oil production. And then we decide to take all of the non-DOMs that live in the UK and say to them, you're going to be taxed on your worldwide wealth. Where do they all go? Every millionaire and billionaire flees to Dubai. And suddenly Dubai is pushing out, and we've got this whole Islamic invasion narrative. We've got the destruction of the energy infrastructure. We've got population fleeing to the Middle East and the Gulf countries. You get rid of all your millionaires and billionaires. Tax revenue goes down. And then what do? You say, I know, wealth tax. So now you've got to be taxed on all your assets. That crashes the market. You crash the market. BlackRock buys up all of the real estate, makes everyone serfs. The cost of energy goes up. What's happening in all this time? The economy is getting worse. Immigration and demographic changes are creating tensions. The pre-crime Palantir technology is being rolled out. We're getting more and more. We get a beta test of what they're about to do in America. You get arrested for your social media posts. Meanwhile, the stock market is at all-time highs in the UK, and debt is at all-time highs, and birth rates are at all-time lows.
Yeah.
This is complete asset stripping of the West, into the stock markets. And then what are they doing with that stock value? They're reallocating capital around other parts of the world that don't have the demographic issues. And what are they going to do? Then they create structural unemployment, and you need AI and robotics to replace all the humans. And then you put them on a UBI and a social credit score to make sure they stay at home. And a stable coin to have.
Most people are
money.
effectively on a subsistence income anyway.
Yes.
And they don't realize it.
Yes.
So like when this UBI thing comes in, I don't even know how that's going to work. Like, does anybody even have an idea of how that's going to work?
Elon seems to know how it's going to work. He says it's going to be a utopia.
No, what does he say? Universal high income. And I just think it's completely ridiculous, because the economic and political system that we have at the moment is based on property rights right now, right? And so no one's been able to explain where this money for just universal basic income is going to come from. If they're going to tax, what are they going to tax? At what levels are they going to tax? We are already seeing now. It's not the statutory tax rates that are the problem. It's the effective tax rates that are so low, combined with the inefficiencies of government spending as well, that's got us in the situation that we are in all Western countries, where we're running deficits just to infinity.
And tax revenues down. Growth is at 1%.
Yeah.
Now we've got an oil crisis.
Yeah. But we don't have proper industrial policy to begin with. So what is the actual purpose of the economy here? Do we have a winning industry at all?
No. There's only one way of explaining it. Keir Starmer doesn't work for the Brits. The European Union don't work for the Europeans. And the American government doesn't work for the Americans. And the Israeli government doesn't work for the Israelis either. Even though people think Israel as a jurisdiction rules the world. They're in the same structure. They're being structurally asset stripped and loaded up with debt.
Okay.
But anyway, so we were doing Iran. So we went over to Europe. Right. Then you have global reset one, COVID, shutdowns, all energy supplies, everyone's on their technology, the world changes, a small group, consolidation of all the small businesses into a few large multinational institutions, bankruptcy of many, many businesses. So we enter into COVID. ESG was to say what happened as a result of ESG. Germany turns off its nuclear energy, which is the most efficient energy that would have saved the manufacturing base. And everyone starts going to climate change net zero. And we're all buying windmills and equipment from China that they can afford to run, but we can't afford to run, which creates inflationary cycles. Then you have an oil shock as a result of agitating Russia to invade Ukraine. Now the printing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're at the end of a debt cycle, right? We're printing like crazy in order to prop up the stock market, while all that value is consolidating in the hands of a fewer and fewer people who are sending the capital abroad. Now we have a problem, right? Things are getting worse. You then have civil unrest because people are saying, what the hell is going on? I can't live. I'm choosing between eating and heating, regime change, Liz Truss in the UK. But anyway, let's not go into that. That was the Bank of England that took her out. And Keir Starmer, his background, like in terms of, he was involved in taking out Julian Assange and given the sex allegations.
He's a company man, right? Yeah. He's got ties to.
Yeah, absolutely. And they all are. Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak. He was the biggest investor in the Moderna, vaccines and all sorts of stuff. Like, this is a racket. The economies in the West are a racket. We've hit the stage where it's just asset stripping, corporate raiding, and the BlackRock portfolio companies and the financial industrial complex will use the fiat currencies for as long as they can use it as collateral to extract as much value, and then usher in a surveillance state and a technocratic nightmare. The West is, that's the future of the West. Okay, so they know that. So what are they doing in this multipolar world? Well, they recognize that America dominated the Middle East. So through these operations that we discussed, you had strategic tension that allowed them to never unify. You never allow them to use their oil. That's got to be a function of the petrodollar in terms of building wealth. But when you allow China to be a manufacturing base, they build wealth. And so they become the exporter of everything. And that requires a lot of energy. So they buy it from the Middle East. Now, the Middle East is looking there saying, I've got a US foreign base here. I own significant influence over America because I co-opted the financial industrial complex through my sovereign wealth fund. Every time they do a deal or IPO, we invest. It's our money. We're propping up the data centers. We're propping up the AI trade. But now we compete with them. And they're trying to take our energy exports. So now we're in a different dynamic. The world has changed. Our money comes from China. Iran is propped up by China. Saudi's propped up by China. Qatar's propped up by China. We get some Europe, but Europe is a pretty dodgy market, right? Europe's looking pretty sketchy. And so America basically decide it's time to switch not America. I believe that the financial industrial complex said we need to switch to multipolarity. It's time to accelerate. How do we accelerate? Let's bring in Trump. So Trump comes along for a second term. Biden does the open borders. Trump does the closed borders. That manufactures civil unrest and helps Palantir build the police state. And Trump has a long-term narrative of tariffs. That's useful. What if we completely liberated the world from the dollar? So Trump does April the 2nd, 2024. Was it 24, 25? I'm losing
25.
25. Mm-hmm. Dollar Liberation Day. Breaks everything. Every relationship that America had built up is now broken. Not only that, but he's got a brilliant narrative. He can say he's taking on the deep state. The deep state props up the dollar. So he ends National Endowment of Democracy, which is where you did all the covert regime change to prop up the dollar. He ends USAID, which is how you fund all the terrorist factories and all the groups to create your militia groups around the world. He releases Epstein files, which reveals without the financial transactions, and the people that control the Epstein files are not in it, but it leverages all of our assets and purges all the assets that we don't need anymore. Remember, right now, the transactions are not coming out for the Epstein files. Bank of New York Mellon is fighting that. That tells you who controls the Epstein files. And it ain't the Department of Justice, and it ain't Trump. It's the financial industrial complex that most likely controls those. It's the money laundering networks. You don't want the transactions, because that's what will actually lead to real arrests. Okay. So then you say, right, what are we doing with the Western Hemisphere? China, Iran, and Russia are in Venezuela. We need to look strong while we're getting weak. The Sun Tzu philosophy: when you're weak, look strong, project strength. We need to shrink. So we do the tariff things. All the small business go bust, consolidate power into the large companies. They go and buy the small companies that are dependent upon the exports. American business implements a new tax, because that was 95% paid by American small business. The large companies, they did an offsetting transaction in their transnational capital flows. So you wipe out more small business. M&A activity on the bank's balance sheet is at all-time high. They're cashing in on the tariffs. And everybody negotiates with China. China had already won the trade war prior to Trump coming in, and tariffs was the execution of losing it while pretending you're trying to win it. And so Trump works for, effectively, all his money is made. If you look at his backers, number one, Elon Musk. Number two, the Bank of New York Mellon family. So you've got technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, and then Mary Madelston, Israel, which is military industrial complex, in that order. So he implements all of the surveillance state technology, says we're going to be crypto capital, does all the AI. And then for FIC, so he does that for TIC. Then for FIC, he does tariffs, which drives everyone to renegotiate with China. He becomes an agent of chaos. He destroys the fabric of everything that makes the dollar stable and the capital markets stable. True Social becomes market manipulation 101. Remember that video where he was pointing at Charles Schwab and saying, "You made $1 billion off that. You made $1 billion off that."
I must have missed that.
Yeah. There was when he was doing every tariff deal, there was someone put a camera in there and he was talking to all of his hedge fund and FIC buddies. He goes over to the Middle East, constructs, I've got $18 trillion of inbound investment. What is $18 trillion of foreign direct investment? Means you're selling your equities. So Saudi stops buying treasuries and starts buying equities. Mm-hmm. Saudi Aramco suddenly gets a board seat on BlackRock. So now the creme de la creme of the financial industrial complex is aligned with China and the Gulf countries and the sovereign wealth funds in Norway. Where all the big sovereign wealth funds in Singapore and various other factions. The world has changed. And so now we need to shrink America, maintain the dollar for as long as we can to asset strip as much as possible. And we need several events. Okay, let's negotiate with Maduro. Elon does the regime change on X. It starts saying how Maduro is evil. He's killing people. Rallies all the Venezuelans. We're gonna make you free. We're gonna liberate you. And then effectively, Maduro. We have this operation that's meant to make America look like the biggest, the baddest, the greatest, the best. Maduro probably made a shit ton of money. The Venezuelan stock market goes up 300%. That's owned by a few banks and probably some corrupt politician, probably Maduro. I'm sure either they co-opted everyone underneath him or he was involved in it anyway. He agrees to have this very theatrical thing. And now you've got what's meant to be the largest oil reserves. But who is actually, prior to the operation, China moved out all of its assets. China moved out, took all of its oil, put it on sea, changed its refining. Like leading up to this, China knew about it. Everyone knew about it. Russia knew about it. Iran knew about it. And then suddenly you come in, you get the drug narrative. We pretend they're taking on drugs. And then suddenly it switches to the oil narrative. Americans are happy. They're like, yeah, we're the empire. We're MAGA. We're taking over all the oil. You know, make America great again. Trump's doing it. Meanwhile, who's building all the infrastructure? If you look at Iraq, China was building all the infrastructure for all that oil. Halliburton was getting all the service contracts. And the Gulf countries were ending up with all of the infrastructure. So the only company that can do the refinement is 100% owned by Saudi Aramco. There was some corrupt Israelis via an M&A deal that happened prior to that managed to get a part of the contract as well. But effectively, Trump is acting as a for-rent militia in order to give resources in a multipolar world. And those Venezuelan resources, I think, were negotiated. And China doesn't react, Russia doesn't react, and Iran doesn't react. So that operation then leads to Iran. So now China, prior to this, had normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is now producing. Iran is 90% of its oil is exported to China. So they're an economic dependent. If China stops buying oil, Iran economically tumbles. All of the sovereign wealth fund that's buying all the US equities are funded by China. The Gulf countries, one by one, start having these weird wars between like UAE and Saudi. Yemen suddenly is controlled by Saudi. Turkey suddenly controls Syria. Turkey also gets its Somalia assets. UAE gets its Somaliland ports. The Kurds start being integrated into the army, and one by one, suddenly everything seems to just start working. We get all this theatrics as if they're all fighting each other, but everything starts to get resolved, and suddenly militias are being replaced by state armies in all these different places. Interesting. Israel, I think in this time, had a mission, which was to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians on October the 7th. If you look at it, Iran stopped funding Hamas when there was a political arm, and the political arm was funded by Qatar, and Hamas's office were in Qatar. That's where the biggest US base is and the biggest US ally. Mm-hmm. So Qatar takes over the funding of Hamas. The banking system in Palestine only gets in via Israel. So Iran stopped funding it when it was a political arm. Then we get October the 7th. Netanyahu couldn't ethnically cleanse the Palestinians because Egypt said we won't let them out the border. IMF said we'll give you $18 billion to do it. They said no because they were backed by China and BRICS. Massive infrastructure investments from China, massive Gulf investments prior to it. So now Netanyahu is effectively can't achieve the goal that the neocons in America, the Zionists in Israel, kind of rely upon. So now we end up where there's effectively a purge. This is when the narrative, this is when X comes along and suddenly we're allowed to talk about Palestine. You get Tucker Carlson and all these people exposing and de-radicalizing evangelical Christians. Then you get Epstein files. You get all of the horrific imagery that came out from the Gaza genocide. Then people are like, what the hell's going on here? You know. Then you get the Epstein files. Oh my God, our government are run by pedophiles. Yeah. Then you get Trump switching from peace president to war president. And then suddenly we're now in an operation that is going to completely reset the world and renegotiate every single oil contract. There was a series of M&A Qatar had already acquired the companies in Texas. Saudi had already acquired the companies in Texas. So if America gets all these oil contracts and LNG contracts to export to Europe, they're covered. So anything you lose here, you make up there. So now all of a sudden you need the final battle, right? So all this to go around. Most people think that US, Israel, and Iran are in a war. There are factions of the Middle East being run as a forever war model. Who props up the forever war model? Extreme hardliners in the IRGC, the funding of proxies that create the strategic tension and justification for Israel, and the American military funding it. That's one faction of power. The neocons in America, the extreme Zionists that are military contractors, and IRGC that created a whole industry around funding the proxies that give them leverage. That's one group. On the other side, you have the financial industrial complex aligned faction of power. Who's that? The Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, China, and the reformist government and the pragmatic IRGC members that are willing to do a deal that was already being negotiated. And you have the financial industrial complex in America that has been negotiating all of their rebuild contracts in Syria, Gaza, Lebanon, all of these different countries, and want to open up Iran. Okay? So this is a battle between the final forever war transition for the military industrial complex. They get to make as much money, and their job is to drain the IRGC of all of their weapons, drain Israel of all of their defense weapons, destroy the economy of Israel, load it up with debt, and make Iran an economic dependent upon China. Do decapitation campaigns to take out those that are not on board with a deal that still profit from the military economy, which is, there was a mafia that was set up within the IRGC that also benefits from the resistance economy. And then once you have a mafia and sanctions, you then work with like Russian groups and all sorts of stuff. Then you're in a power structure you can't get out of. And so that's why the forever war persisted. China wants regional stability and America to exit the region. So what happens? America allows the Gulf countries to invest in Texas and be covered for anything that happens to them. China and Russia give intelligence to the reformist and pragmatic elements of the IRGC and the government. And the hardliners immediately are blowing up US bases in the Gulf countries, and the Gulf are not reacting. Then you have the blowing up of oil resources and natural gas resources that pumps the price of oil to $115 after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I believe the financial industrial complex wanted the closure of Hormuz. What enforced the closure? There was no button that said we're closed. The parliament voted on it. The government, not the IRGC, voted on it. The IRGC said we'll blow up anyone that tries to pass it. But it was actually the insurance, the Lloyd's of London, that shut the Strait of Hormuz. They continued to insure the planes. They continued to fund all of the Red Sea disruption that was the same as the Strait of Hormuz. But they made it 75% and basically uninsurable in the Strait of Hormuz. That created the almighty pump and dump. So who benefits? Russia, Chevron, Exxon, and Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. Russia gets to sell all of its oil and help Asia to keep things flowing for the financial industrial complex. America says, hey, Europe, you can either go to Russia or you can come to us. And then America gives sanction relief to Russia in order to get the price of oil down because it's about to break everything. At the price of oil at $160, we enter into a global financial crisis that is demand destructive to absolutely everyone. At a price of $110 per oil, we know that the fit kick in and they start doing futures contracts. They start releasing strategic petroleum reserves, and they give sanction relief to Russia in order to get the oil price
What
down.
are we at now? Around about 100, isn't it?
Last time I looked before this interview, we were at 103, around about 103, 106. We need, I think, very similar to the 12-day war, a three-way victory that leads to an already predetermined outcome. And there are radicalists that in the military-industrial complex aligned faction of Israel, Iran, and America that need to be satisfied. And you'll end up with regime change in Israel. And we've already had decapitation campaigns in Iran. And the oil price sets the predetermined. Now, if this were a genuine war and there wasn't an understood deadline by the FIC, the price of gold would have been through the roof with oil. You would have oil and gold in tandem. Gold's just been flat. Like it just hasn't done anything. In fact, it's slightly down, I think.
Not yet, but we haven't seen the economic consequences flow through yet.
Correct.
So we'll see what happens on that front.
So once you get gold and oil moving in tandem, then you know we're in a situation. So now the current situation is we have oil that's between 100 and 110. There is massive futures positions that I think were taken out by US Treasury in order to oppress the price. We've had sanctions relief. So China wants this war Russia is the winner of the war so far. They used to sell oil at 35 to 40 cents a barrel. They're now selling it at 100, and the world needs them. And they can get oil anywhere.
Did you say 35 or 40 cents?
Yeah, they would have been, during the peak of the sanctions, they would have been, dollars, not cents.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So they would have been selling it at the peak of sanctions at a discount for that kind of price. Now they're writing checks. So
Well, they had an interesting situation with India where they were selling discounted oil to India. The US said, hey, stop that. They're sanctioned. India stops it.
Yep.
Trump later on lifts the sanctions. India says, okay, we'll buy your oil again. And I said, okay, but you're not getting a discount now.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay.
And what was the other half of that? The other half of that is there was a farming revolt in India because because India was importing its agricultural from America. And so what else does the Strait of Hormuz close? Fertilizers. And then Qatar shut the production of liquefied natural gas, which means that creates a agricultural disaster. And so now they get to buy the farmers get screwed in India, and America gets to sell its agriculture to make up for the disaster this year. They get some GDP, they get some growth, The dollar starts strengthening throughout this whole war. Bitcoin starts going up throughout this whole war. So now you reversed all the dollar weakening. The S&P performs better than all the foreign stock markets because Europe and Asia are screwed. China had already built like the largest oil reserves in the world. They also had their renewable energy and various other things. And Iran is selling record levels of gas and oil to China because it's open to China. So the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and China is open, but not for anyone else. Russia can get all of its oil everywhere. Europe gets to now, in the time frame that the strait is closed, screwed. I either buy from Russia or I buy from America. America's going to say that's going to cost you a massive premium and a 20-year contract. You get to vassalize Europe further, screwed again. Energy crisis, recession, real property crash in UK and Europe. And then America creates the full dependency. Russia is deeply integrated into Asia. So you've really split the world up into helping BRICS. Iran is effectively, the US media is saying we're kicking ass, Iran's dead. Iran is in an asymmetric war where they're getting weakened, no doubt, but the strait is still closed. And the price of oil is dependent upon America's ability to get ships through, which he keeps saying, we're done, just go through. No one's getting through. the strait is still closed.
Mm-hmm.
Saudi and UAE created alternative pipelines. So we got 20 million barrels that come offline. 20% of global oil supply is offline. Their alternative routes get 9 million barrels through, and then you can get the oil to China. You have split the world into multipolarity. Mission accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
Now you need three things in order to get rid of the military-industrial complex forever war factions. You need to take out decapitation campaigns within Iran in the IRGC. Notice how everybody that was at the negotiation table prior to this, Oman had announced that the deal was done.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a framework. China will provide security guarantees. Russia will take the highly enriched uranium, and we'll go to zero enrichment. That was announced in Oman. Oman mediators came out saying we got the framework for a deal. And then America escalates on Saturday. And so everyone that was sat around that table, Arachi, the various I get the name wrong, the prime minister of the reform government, Primishkov, I think Primishki, something like that. Perishkian, yeah. They're still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And then they replace Khomeini with Khomeini. And we'll see what comes next. But it looks like Khomeini was already cooperating. And maybe he decided that in order to get the IRGC online with China's vision, I need to go out. Israel gets his narrative. America gets his narrative. Khomeini is credible enough where, remember, the end of Iraq-Iran war was when the Grand Supreme Leader said, we have to do this. It has to end. And then they have to follow the Supreme Leader.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes down the IRGC structure.
Yeah.
The IRG structure that profits from the banking cartel, the military-industrial complex, they're either gone or they're integrated. The proxies are being eliminated one by one. Israel is strategically weakened because it's going to be dumped by America or military budgets. And now it works for the FIC rather than the MIC.
Mm-hmm.
And so
does that mean that the destroyed bases in the Gulf countries are not rebuilt in America leaves?
I reckon that's the part. So I always said, in order to have peace in the Middle East, you need three things. Resolve the Palestinian cause,
Mm-hmm.
Which is Israel. Then you need to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and you need US to exit the region. This is a US exit. They have outsourced to Iran the removal of the US bases, and now those will most likely. What was it immediately that the Gulf countries said? We're going to reconsider our investments.
Yeah.
What are those investments? Defense and AI.
Mm-hmm.
That breaks the private credit markets in the US. We get the big withdrawals. That breaks the growth potential. They need the Gulf money to come back because all of the data centers was all the growth. So you get extreme financial stress in America. They have to crash the price of oil. The only way to crash the price of oil is to give concessions to the reformist faction of the IRGC, which is going to be pushed into China because China wrote the whole game. Trump gets credit. Affinity partners is what bridged Trump. While everyone was focused on Trump being controlled by Israel, he had a multi-billion-dollar fund managed by Jared Kushner that was funded by the Gulf countries that gets him a Trump Tower across the Middle East, that gets him all of the investments that he wants. It's had 0% returned, and it's just been sat there with billions of dollars of capital managed by Jared Kushner. You get to bribe the Israeli elites that need to be bribed into allowing this to happen. And then at the end of this, you regime change Israel and put in a GCC puppet, just like you put in Syria, a GCC and Turkey puppet. They will be leftist. They will expose, they'll say, what happened on October the 7th, and they'll appease the people that have been protesting. And then who takes credit for it all? Trump, which is why he set up the border peace. Who is the border peace funded by? It's funded by the Gulf countries. And so you're going to build a technocratic Orwellian nightmare in Gaza. Israel's likely to be regime changed. The forever war comes to an end. The IRGC hardliners are taken out. The US military bases are expelled. The price of oil makes extreme stress. All of those oil and gas contracts are renegotiated. And my belief is that there are factions that are trying to derail this plan in the military industrial complex, both in Israel, Iran, and America, the neocons, the Zionists, and the IRGC hardliners that built the war economy. And then there's China, the FIC, and the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, but they'll win. And I think they'll win at the end. The world is meant to believe this goes to World War III. I don't think it goes to World War III. If this goes on for 2 weeks and the price of oil is above $120, we're going to have extreme stress in America. Something's going to break. If they can get the price of oil down, then this can carry on a little bit longer. There is no chance of a long-term forever war. They need to crash the price of oil, and the only way to do that is to have a deal. So how do you get to a deal? My prediction is you need a three-way victory, just like the 12-Day War. America says we took out Khomeini, we've annihilated the weapons, the nuclear program is over, whether it's true or not.
Well, I tried to do that, and Iran said, we're not stopping until our objectives are met.
Yeah. But I believe there is an internal faction of both IRGC and Iran reformists that's aligned with China and moving towards regional stability. And they're doing internal regime change rather than external regime change. Because if they get regime change, that turns Iran into Syria. And that's not good for anyone. No one wants that. And so
it's good for Israel.
Well, you say that, but the destruction of America and chaos in Iran with a population of 90 million that creates a vacuum is returning to the forever war model. So it's good for the military industrial complex. It's good for the hardliners in Iran, and it's good for Israel radical Zionists that want to maintain their role, which is why I don't think if Netanyahu is dead today, my fear is that he was managing the transition of MIC to FIC. And as much as I hate that bastard, what would replace him might be MIC aligned and worse. And so there might have been an internal, I'm not sure whether he's gone or not, but if he is, it might have been an inside job from the MIC aligned faction of Israel. It might have been the MIC aligned. So Netanyahu is the less extreme version of the leaders in Israel.
You think there's worse to come?
Oh,
so Ben Gvir, Naftali Bennett, and there are a couple of others that whose names escape me.
Yeah.
So we've already got Naftali Bennett,
Yeah.
former prime minister, no less, and he's a much younger man also.
Yeah.
He's already saying once this is over, Turkey's next.
Yeah. So those represent the MIC-aligned faction that want the forever war. The forever war is do it in Iran, then do it in Turkey, continue forever. The Greater Israel Project is a narrative for MIC profits. And so it's a very complicated operation. This is a once-in-a-lifetime change, but there is a time frame on this. Because if you lose all your strategic reserves globally, your petroleum reserves, and you've got a short futures position to oppress the price, and Russian sanctions is the only thing you can do to open up oil and get it where it needs to go without entering into a global financial crisis, because a global financial crisis breaks everyone's banks because they're all connected. And that breaks the Japan carry trade and the hedge fund Cayman Island basis trade, which is rolling over the US debt. The US has to have higher growth than the average interest on its debt. The average interest rate on its debt is currently 3.3%. If it goes below 3.3%, America breaks. If it goes into a recession, it's got the largest percentage deficit it's ever had, 6%. The last time it had 6% was World War II. If you get lower growth than 3.3%, and the Japan carry trade and the hedge fund Cayman basis trade breaks, and you have an oil crisis that leads to inflation, and and you're paying a higher interest rate on the debt because the long-term rates are going up globally now as a result of this, you would end up with a reduction of tax revenue that would put America's deficit from 6% to 15%, which is unprecedented and breaks America. You have to crash the price of oil, and you need to have done it yesterday. That's reality.
We touched on the petrodollar deal between United States and Saudi Arabia, and now that we've seen Iran obliterate all the bases, and in fact America utilize resources, repurpose and redistribute resources from those bases to Israel. What does that do to the petrodollar? Doesn't that undermine its very existence?
Yes, by design. This was the operation. So they broke the euro dollar, they broke the Japan carry trade, and now they're breaking the petrodollar. So now the problem is that the currency is strengthening from this war. They need it to go back to where it was. So they need a deal. And then once you hit a deal, foreign stock markets will start outperforming the S&P again, and foreign currencies will start outperforming the dollar. Now you have returned to the dollar strengthening, which is a problem. So now you need to return. Once you return, then you can sell your treasuries, you can buy gold, and you can remove your pegs to the dollar over time in this managed transition. The second the strait is open again, we are in a completely different world to the one we were before. We're already in a completely different world. This is going to take months of supply chain issues. There's fertilizers, there's all sorts of stuff. There's all the enrichment. There's South Korea can't make a semiconductor chip because it's got certain components. Everyone's focused on oil. We're already in COVID level of disruption if it opens today. But if this stays closed for another 2 weeks, it can't stay closed for 2 months. If it's closed for 2 months and the price of oil hits 150 or above, we're in global financial crisis, recession, just worse than 2008. Everything breaks. And I know the FIC doesn't want that, so I don't think they'll let it get there.
Yeah, so that's demand destruction, right?
Correct.
And
you got it right.
Down.
So it's inflation as a result of oil price.
Yeah.
Then it hits the price where no one can afford anything, so they stop consuming. Then it's demand destruction, which is a deflationary spiral in recession. Exactly what happened during inflation is transitory, Biden going to MBS, saying flood the market, all that stuff.
That's why I think, Larry Lepard's The Big Print, that's coming.
The big print is coming, and maybe the big taking is coming as well, the great taking. Those predictions are likely to come true. There is no alternative but big print after this. Yeah. And the big print will be return to fiscal dominance, weakening of the dollar, and then capital outflows and multipolar world. Anyway, we are as soon as the strait is open, we're back to dealing with the fallout. But we are in a multipolar world. The US empire is over officially today. There's no returning to it.
Yeah.
If there's one exception, if America, which I don't think is the goal, is actually doing what MAGA think they're doing, which is occupy the oil and take over Iran and force Iran onto the dollar. But if you look at the sanctions contract between Russia when they give the sanction relief, it wasn't demanding the dollar. Those were priced in foreign currencies as well as dollar. So there's only two ways this goes. Mick wins, in which case they occupy, the American empire is stronger than ever and everything's priced in dollars. Or FIC wins, which means that America is now a regional power. We're in multipolar world order. The war ends. The IRGC is maintained, but they are normalized between China and effectively, if you look at the word Middle East, what was that? That was the London colonizers looking eastwards and saying that's the middle of the world. Prior to that, it was called West Asia. The Middle East is now West Asia. It's done. There's no reversal.
So Petrodollar's dead.
The petrodollar is in a managed transition, and they don't want to break anything, but they'll do the same as what they did with the pound.
An American empire, it's the beginning of the end.
Yes.
They will not rebuild their bases.
They may negotiate some kind of contract and dependency based upon tick power.
Mm-hmm.
They may say, get some AI there,
Mm-hmm.
get some cybersecurity there. We'll get you to buy weapons, but those weapons will be hedged with China and Russia, I think. Probably even Iran eventually. But the purpose of them is not to serve Israel and the US empire, because China rules the game. And China will not allow a US proxy Israel to destabilize the region. It will not allow Gulf countries to have US bases that are there for destabilization. And it will not allow Iran to go hardliner and, get back to strategic tension between Iran and Israel.
So
China rules the game. Trump takes credit.
Iran right now is under severe global sanctions because of the US. What is their predicament after this war?
The golden crown, based upon strategic targets being met, proxies being eliminated,
Mm-hmm.
milestones being set, which China will set with. And by the way, in April, we got the Xi Jinping Trump meeting.
Mm-hmm.
They're leading up to that.
That's like
that's
2.5 weeks away.
Yes.
2 weeks away. Yeah.
Which is perfect timing for how quick this has to be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll find out whether I'm wrong or right based upon whether the petrodollar is maintained through taking over Iran, occupying
Well,
Iran.
you would expect that they would have an outline of a deal to be ratified at that meeting, right?
This deal has been negotiated over 7 years. It started with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It started with the October the 7th. It continued with the elimination or the stopping and support of proxies. This has been a long-term negotiation. The deal was already done and Trump was installed to execute. That's why Trump, he's so inconsistent right now. He doesn't know what's coming next. His PR outfit is so inconsistent because he doesn't know what's happening. He's not running this war. He's not making decisions. This is being run by the deep state. This is the MIC. This is the FIC. This is the intelligence networks. This is negotiations with China. Trump is just the PR man. And everyone's saying, is Trump gone crazy? No, he hasn't gone crazy. He just doesn't know what's coming next. He's being told on a need-to-know basis, I think. These are middle management. Same with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is just there for personal survival.
So on
doesn't
Iran,
rule
you think the sanctions will be lifted and their entrance into the world will be renormalized?
Yeah, the big ticket is for FIC to get as much, maybe a bit of Strait of Hormuz so that they can guarantee it doesn't happen again. No closure. Opening up of markets in Syria and Iran. That would be how they make up for lost returns with the fall of the US empire. Iran and Syria in the center of the world without MIC destabilizing the region with vast energy moving into an AI and robotics and nuclear powered world. That's where they make up
I can imagine Iran being at least the equivalent of Turkey. They're certainly more educated than the Turkish population, for example. And so why can't their productive capacity be equal to or greater than Turkey's?
Iran is a powerhouse. If you open up sanctions, they got the army, they've got the resources, they've got the education, they've got the cultural background. They've got historical, that's why it had to be shut down. That's why they had to contain Iran. This has been 100 years of colonization from the British Empire to the American Empire. You can never let Iran and the Gulf countries unify, back it by China and Russia. That's the end of the US empire. And that world will have a lot less war. A lot less war. It would be a much better world. I think competition, regional stability, and the end of this demonic MIC-led empire. But it's dangerous because BlackRock is still the largest asset manager in the world. And the capital markets, you've got 5 trillion of sovereign wealth there. China's got all the capital. But FIC they want to be glued together to make money from regional stability. And I think that was the plan. And I'm very bullish on the rest of the world. I think the West is going to get worse and worse. I think Africa is going to be able to rise. I think the Middle East is going to be the highest growth. And I think China won't be a dominant empire because India will build a manufacturing base. Other one will have.
We've been waiting for India for 25 years. Since China emerged as an economic global power, people have been looking at India to emerge. And what's happened?
India and UAE are thick infiltrations of the Middle Eastern BRICS. So they want to vassalize India and UAE as much as possible so that they can get, and Israel, they're vassalizing Israel, UAE, and India. That's why we had this, like the Pakistan-India little writ. And then you had all the defense agreements between Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And then an alternative front was formed between UAE, India, and Israel. And these are to try and create strategic tensions. This UAE, India, Israel represents FIC now. It used to represent MIC. Israel used to represent MIC. I think UAE and Saudi are playing good cop, bad cop. UAE takes the reputational hit because you get to buy all of the Israeli assets through the normalization agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And India gets to buy the Mossad military industrial complex. And India and China probably becomes the next future strategic tension.
So we spoke earlier about the exodus of millionaires from the United Kingdom, and you just mentioned the UAE. So I guess it's an opportune time to mention Dubai. Dubai gets a lot of attention for all sorts of reasons. And they've done a tremendous job of generating alternative. I mean, people still think that they make their money from oil, which they don't. They don't at all. They don't. Is it even 5 or 10%?
No,
it's basically zero, right?
Yeah, it's a FIC powerhouse.
Yeah. It is a financial powerhouse. But it does seem that this US-Israeli war on Iran has burst that bubble.
Yeah, I doubt it. Firstly, if you look at the deals in Texas, they were hedged to benefit from, in the US asset stripping exercise, Qataris and Saudis certainly. But UAE is too strategically important to FIC. UAE is their mechanism for trying to get a grip hold in the region. And so what's happened? The price of real estate has corrected like 30%, I think they're saying.
Yep, last I checked.
But look at the deals. Institutional investors are buying it off retail. Institutions see the future. They don't think this is systemic. FIC is going to buy up everything they can buy up into this weakness and make it a vassal so that they can apply tension to Saudi. Because Saudi has now got BlackRock's head office. It's got a bunch of the banks. It did a dollar-denominated bond through a Chinese investment bank. It opened up its stock market prior to this to foreign investors. And it started being the one that was pushing back against Israel. It was the one that said, we're not going to normalize and join Abraham Accords until there's a Palestinian cause. So Saudi is the kingpin of the GCC. UAE is the bulldog. And Qatar has the European relationships. And all of them are an intermediary between Chinese capital and BRICS capital and Asian capital and the financial industrial complex of the West. They're going to sit in the middle with a tax haven, and FIC want to turn UAE into their playground, so they want to buy it all. So this is just a distressed asset acquisition of the UAE.
So what do you think Jared Kushner is doing right now, where he's coincidentally, perhaps opportunistically, raising a fund and he's doing a tour of the Middle East, looking to raise $5 billion? Is this him putting the hat out?
Yeah.
Or let's just say, let's use a different term. Is he wetting the beak,
yeah,
to use a Godfather theme, before the deals are actually finalized?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what happened. Remember what you have, like in Syria. Do you remember there was like, so the head of ISIS became like the placeholder president, Jelani. He went to meet Trump at the White House. Trump was putting perfume on the head of ISIS. That just shows you how this world really works. And then what happened? Trump went to meet all the banks. The banks started to front run all of the deals in Syria. And then you had the narrative, oh, they're killing the Christians. They're killing the Christians and all that BS. So they created all of the destabilization narrative in the West. There was an uprising of one of the proxies. They then said, that's the Muslims killing the Christians, even though it was all the different factions. And they were trying to contain an old faction of power that was aligned with the Assad. And then they did all the deals into that weakness. So they're trying to make it like Syria's about to be taken over by Israel and it's always going to be in a war and it's going to return to 2011 dirty war. While they buy up as much as they can, then they'll do sanctions relief and then they'll open up.
Well, they did take Syrian land.
Yes.
They did annex more Syrian land, including one of the mountains which has a ski resort on it in the Middle East of all places. So,
and I think that is Netanyahu being useful to the fiqh, knowing that these deals are going to be done and he needs to negotiate that he doesn't go to prison and that all of his crimes against humanity go away. And so he's been leveraging his utility, gain as much land as possible while they push the Greater Israel narrative. And then that's all going to be strategically acquired via these negotiations. And Jared Kushner, what's his role? His role is to take all of the Gulf money and also get all the Zionist oligarchs and billionaires that need to be bribed or financially benefit from regional stability so that they stop working for Mike and get rid of all the Mike people that aren't on board and all the radicals. It's. I think that's how it's going to play out over the next 5 years.
And you know, Bitcoin. How does that play into all of this? Because you know, we've got gold, we've got oil. What happens to Bitcoin?
Accumulate. Whether they want to, whether they've accumulated enough. I think there was massive manipulation. I started looking into the Jane Street allegations.
Do you think it was a coincidence that as soon as Jane Street was issued notice that they're under investigation for market manipulation on another matter, that, you know, I think this is what Zero Hedge was posting about, that they basically, you know, pulled their heads in and stopped what they were doing on Bitcoin?
I think I did an investigation, the whole 10 a.m.
The 10 a.m. slam that the
10
Zero
a.m.
Hedge
slam.
was calling it. Yeah.
There were days that's done, but it wasn't consistent. There were more days.
It doesn't need to be every single day.
Correct.
But there was clearly a pattern at 10 a.m. on the dot.
Correct.
On many, many days.
And they were being investigated for that in India, South Korea, and China. And
when you say that, that's market manipulation in general, right?
For that exact structure of taking an ETF construct, being an appointed representative, being able to print the Bitcoin ETF or the silver ETF shares, and then having a time frame until you've got to match it with the underline.
Yep.
And then using media manipulation to push out stories. And then buy spot and sell significantly more futures so that you can pump the price and then push it back down and then come buy in and accumulate a position. But we don't know, on the bit about Jane Street's balance sheet is we don't know. We know that they're the largest holder of IBIT Bitcoin ETF, but because they're a private company, we don't know what the other side of their derivatives are. And also, I started investigating a bit. This is not conclusive, but we've got all these investigations that don't happen in the US, but do happen in India, South Korea, and China, implying to me that it's a potential protective class of FIC. But also, if you look at the founder, the information on this company is very hard to come by, but the founder was once fined for giving $7 million to pay for a coup in Sudan. So that implies to me that he claimed that it was just, he thought it was humanitarian aid, but he was effectively funding a coup in Sudan. There's suspicion to me that this is a protective a protected institution. And it is the mechanism for price manipulation. And it seems, remember the whole thing we were talking about Bitcoin and Epstein and MIT? Remember, that's the same MIT and DCI that Gary Gensler came from. And Gary Gensler, who was chair of the SEC, whilst allowing Operation Choke Point 2.0 to happen for the financial institutions, and also meeting SBF and no one else in the industry to write the regulations that made the foundation for Clarity Act and Genius Act today. So there is definitely a FIC protected class. The same people that we don't know were shorting stocks and before 9/11. These same financial operations. And I've got a feeling that Howard Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald is probably one of those institutions. And the fact that he got a role in the Trump administration, while Steve Witkoff, a mob New York real estate tycoon, connected to Israel, and also made a loan to Urban Movers, which was the front company that did the bombing in 9/11 that was covered in the FBI documents. Everyone around the Trump administration seems to be from these things, but he became envoy to the Middle East, and he became a shareholder in World Liberty Financial. And remember CZ, when he got taken out for 4 months, they installed a compliance team that took over all the data. And then they started shutting down all the Turkish accounts, Lebanese accounts, and Palestinian accounts as part of the genocide financial warfare, as requested by Israel. So you can see that there's been infiltration into these different things. But World Liberty Financial is Steve Witkoff and Trump. And then you've got the Bitcoin treasury companies and Cantor Fitzgerald. All of the money laundering behind these bribes from Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund that led to them becoming a shareholder in Binance, that led to the pardon of CZ. These are all happening by a Trump stablecoin, World Liberty Financial. And the only thing that's stopping Clarity Act coming through right now is that the Democrats are looking at all this corruption and saying this is problematic. So yeah, the country's run by mafia and pedophiles. Europe's going to be really struggling. American empire is over, but if you're rich and you've got assets, you'll be on the right side of the K-shaped economy. It's still the most liquid market. I think Africa might be able to use its resources. I think the Middle East is going to be the highest growth region. I think the world under China, I hope, won't be regime change similar to America. I think they'll just trade and say, you run your country how you want. And there'll be massive competition. And I think strategic tension between India and China is like the next thing that we need to watch. And where does Bitcoin sit in that? I couldn't think of anywhere I'd rather be than self-custody, running a node with a digital asset that I can send to anyone at scale, that I can take to me in any country, wherever I go. And I think the financial institutions know that. That's why they try to accumulate and centralize as much of it as possible. And that's why they try to infiltrate as much control grids as possible. And Bitcoin is stronger than it's ever been. So I don't care about the price. Use the price opportunity to build a 10-year plan, measure your wealth in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than last month, enjoy any price go down. And if this turns out that one of these crazies are going to blow up a nuke, everything's going to crash, and it's gold in your hand and Bitcoin in self-custody. That's the only thing that's going to help you.
That's a perfect time to just wrap this up. And Simon Dixon, thank you very much.
What a few months. Thanks,
Yeah.
Archie.
Thanks, man.